Ancient Trade Routes, How Merchants Changed the World.
Chapter 1. The Silk Road, Threads Connecting Empires. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern walls of Chang'an when Wei Zhao began his final preparations. For 3 months he had assembled what he hoped would be the most profitable caravan of his career: 200 camels, 50 horses, and 47 men willing to risk their lives crossing the most treacherous landscapes on Earth. The year was 1380 BCE, and the Han Dynasty had recently opened systematic trade with the distant lands to the west, lands so remote that most Chinese believed them to be mythical realms populated by spirits and demons.
Wei stood in the enormous warehouse district near the western gate, watching his workers carefully load the final bales of silk onto the kneeling camels. Each bolt of fabric represented months of labor by skilled artisans who raised silkworms on mulberry leaves, harvested the delicate cocoons, and wove the gossamer threads into lustrous cloth that seemed to capture light itself. The silk production process remained China's most closely guarded secret, protected by imperial decree. Anyone who revealed the techniques to foreigners would face execution, their entire family condemned. This monopoly on silk production had made certain merchants extraordinarily wealthy, and Wei intended to join their ranks.
The caravan's composition reflected years of hard-won experience. The Bactrian camels, with their 2 humps and thick coats, could survive the brutal temperature extremes of the Taklamakan Desert, where summer days could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit and winter nights plunged below zero. Each camel carried approximately 400 pounds of goods, primarily silk, but also lacquerware, bronze mirrors, and the finest porcelain from kilns in southern China. The horses, smaller and hardier than the magnificent Central Asian breeds Wei hoped to acquire on this journey, carried the guards and scouts who would protect the caravan from bandits and navigate the treacherous route ahead.
Wei, second in command, a grizzled veteran named Liang who had made this journey 7 times, approached with the final supply calculations. "We have provisions for 4 months, Liang reported, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "Water for 30 days between major oases, assuming we don't encounter delays. The men are ready, though 3 of the new recruits already look terrified, and we haven't even left the city." Wei nodded, understanding the fear. He had felt it himself on his first journey westward 10 years ago. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a network of routes spanning over 4,000 miles, threading through some of the harshest environments on Earth. Few merchants traveled the entire distance. Instead, goods changed hands multiple times, with Chinese merchants typically venturing only as far as the great oasis cities of the Tarim Basin, where Sogdian Gudelmen from Central Asia would purchase the goods and carry them further west to Persian traders, who would eventually sell them to merchants from distant Rome.
This relay system, while less profitable than direct trade, had evolved for good reasons. The journey was simply too long, too dangerous, and too culturally complex for any single merchant to manage effectively. Language barriers multiplied with each passing mile. Political allegiances shifted like desert sands. What was considered respectful behavior in one kingdom might be a mortal insult in another. The Sogdians had become masters of this complexity, their society producing natural polyglots and cultural chameleons who could negotiate in Chinese, Persian, Sanskrit, and Greek with equal facility.
As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets, an imperial messenger arrived, bearing a silk banner emblazoned with the emperor's seal, official permission to depart, and a reminder that Wei carried not just commercial goods, but China's prestige. The Silk Road had become an instrument of soft power, with trade missions serving diplomatic purposes. The legendary Zhang Qian, who had first opened these routes under Emperor Wu, had been an imperial envoy before becoming a trader, and his journey had transformed Chinese understanding of the wider world.
Wei raised his hand, and the caravan lurched into motion. 200 camels rose with their characteristic grumbling protests, their bells chiming a discordant symphony that would become the constant soundtrack of the journey ahead. The citizens of Chang'an, accustomed to such departures, barely glanced at the procession, though children ran alongside begging for copper coins. The city itself was a wonder of the ancient world, its population exceeding 250,000,
its walls enclosing markets where goods from across Asia changed hands. The western gate through which they departed was 30 feet high and wide enough for 3 wagons to pass abreast, its stones worn smooth by centuries of traffic.
Beyond the walls, the landscape transformed quickly. The fertile plains surrounding Chang'an gave way to more arid terrain as they traveled northwest toward the Hexi Corridor, the narrow passage between the Tibetan Plateau and the Mongolian steppes that had channeled trade for millennia. This corridor, barely 60 miles wide in places, was the only practical route westward from China proper. To the south rose the impassable Kilian Mountains, their peaks perpetually snow-capped. To the north stretched the wastes of the Gobi Desert, where water sources were too scarce and scattered to support large caravans.
The first week passed uneventfully as they covered approximately 15 miles per day, a pace calculated to preserve the animal's strength for the harder stages ahead. Wei used this time to establish routines and observe his men. The caravan woke before dawn, loaded the animals, and traveled until the heat became oppressive, usually around midday. They would rest through the hottest hours, then continue until sunset before making camp. Guards rotated on 2-hour watches throughout the night, for bandits preferred to attack in darkness, and the goods they carried were worth more than most men would see in a lifetime.
Around the evening campfires, the merchants and guards told stories, shared information, and forged the bonds that might save their lives in the trials ahead. One guard, a Xiongnu tribesman named Temur, who had served as a scout for the imperial army, described the desert ahead with a mixture of respect and dread. "The Taklamakan is not like other deserts," he warned, his accent thick but his Chinese comprehensible. "Its name means go in and you won't come out. The sand dunes sing in the wind, voices of those who died there. Some travelers see cities on the horizon, beautiful cities with water and shade. But when you approach, they vanish, just tricks of the heat and desperation." Another merchant, an older man named Chen, who had traded along the Silk Road for 3 decades, dismissed such talk as superstition. "The real dangers are practical," he insisted. "Sandstorms that rise in minutes and can bury a man standing upright, water sources that have dried up since the last caravan passed, bandits who know every hiding place and can disappear into the desert like smoke. Respect these dangers, prepare for them, and you'll survive. Fill your head with ghost stories, and you'll panic when clear thinking is what you need." We listened to both perspectives, understanding that truth lay somewhere between them. He had seen the desert's mirages himself, convincing hallucinations born in heat exhaustion and dehydration. He had also witnessed a sandstorm's fury, a wall of darkness that turned day to night and scoured exposed skin like 1,000 knives. Survival required both mystical respect for the desert's power and practical preparation for its challenges.
3 weeks into the journey, they reached Dunhuang, the last major Chinese settlement before the desert crossing. The city sat at the convergence of the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan Desert, a crucial decision point for caravans. The northern route offered more reliable water sources, but passed through territories controlled by various nomadic tribes whose allegiances shifted constantly. The southern route, while longer, generally provided more stable political conditions, but traversed even more extreme terrain.
Dunhuang itself was a revelation for the younger merchants who had never traveled this far west. The city's population was far more diverse than Chang'an's, with Sogdians, Indians, Persians, and even a few Greeks mingling in markets where a dozen languages echoed simultaneously. Buddhist monks in saffron robes walked alongside Zoroastrian priests in white. The architectural styles blended Chinese curved roofs with Central Asian domes and Indian arched doorways, creating a visual vocabulary unique to the Silk Road.
Wei led a small group to visit the Mogao Caves, a complex of Buddhist grottos carved into the cliff faces outside the city. Inside, they found hundreds of caves, each containing elaborate murals and sculptures that depicted Buddhist teachings. But what fascinated Wei most was how the artwork blended influences from across Asia. Chinese dragons coexisted with Indian lotus flowers and Persian geometric patterns. The Buddha himself appeared in various forms, sometimes with distinctly Chinese features, other times with the darker skin and curled hair of Indian depictions. occasionally with the flowing robes and realistic proportions of Greek sculpture.
"This is what the Silk Road creates," observed a monk who served as their guide, his Chinese excellent but flavored with Sanskrit intonations. "Not just an exchange of goods, but a mingling of souls. Every merchant who passes through carries ideas along with silk and spices. Buddhism came to China on these routes, carried by monks and traders who saw no contradiction between spiritual seeking and commercial profit. The Dharma, like silk, is a precious thing that increases in value when shared."
The monk's words resonated with Wei in unexpected ways. He had always conceived of his work in purely commercial terms: risks taken, profits earned, a family legacy to build. But standing in these caves, seeing how trade had enabled cultural and spiritual exchange on a scale unprecedented in human history, he felt a strange pride. The Silk Road was more than a means to wealth. It was the mechanism by which humanity was learning that the world was larger, more diverse, and more interconnected than anyone had previously imagined.
In Dunhuang's markets, Wei made several crucial acquisitions. He purchased detailed route information from a Sogdian merchant who had just completed the westward journey, learning that several oases on the northern route were experiencing tribal conflicts that made passage dangerous. This intelligence, worth its weight in silver, convinced Wei to take the southern route despite its greater distance. He also hired 2 additional scouts who knew the desert intimately, men who could read the subtle signs that indicated water sources, the flight patterns of certain birds, the presence of specific plants, the color and texture of distant rock formations.
The preparation of silk for desert crossing required meticulous care. The fabric had to be protected from sand, moisture, and extreme temperature fluctuations, any of which could damage its quality and reduce its value. Wise workers wrapped each bolt in multiple layers of oil-treated cloth, then packed them in wooden crates sealed with wax. These crates were then distributed across multiple camels, ensuring that if one animal was lost, the entire shipment wouldn't be compromised.
Wei also took time to explain to the younger merchants why silk commanded such astronomical prices in distant Rome, where a pound of silk could cost as much as a pound of gold. "The Romans cannot produce it themselves," he explained. "They don't know that silk comes from worms that eat mulberry leaves. Some believe it grows on trees, others that it's the fleece of special sheep. Their ignorance protects our profit. But the real value lies in the fabric's qualities, its luster, its strength despite its delicacy, the way it drapes and moves, how it accepts dyes more vibrantly than any other textile. Roman senators have passed laws trying to limit silk consumption, calling it decadent, but the demand only grows. Their women, in particular, prize it above all other fabrics."
The silk production process was indeed remarkable, a technology that had taken centuries to perfect. Female silkworms, after mating, laid hundreds of eggs that hatched into tiny larvae. These larvae were fed fresh mulberry leaves constantly for approximately 30 days, during which they grew to many times their original size. When ready to pupate, each larva spun a cocoon from a single continuous thread of silk that could measure up to 3,000 feet long. Skilled workers would carefully unwind these threads, combining multiple strands to create silk yarn of the desired thickness, which was then woven into fabric on specialized looms.
The Han Dynasty protected this process through both secrecy and deterrence. Not only was revealing silk production techniques punishable by death, but border officials carefully inspected all outgoing caravans to ensure no one was smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds. This monopoly had persisted for centuries and would continue for centuries more, until eventually, according to legends Wei had heard, Byzantine monks would successfully smuggle silkworm eggs to Constantinople hidden in hollow walking sticks, breaking China's monopoly.
After a week in Dunhuang, during which the men and animals rested and recovered their strength, Wei ordered the caravan to depart. They left at sunset to take advantage of the cooler night temperatures for the first stage of the desert crossing. As the city's lights faded behind them, the enormity of the landscape ahead became apparent. The Taklamakan Desert stretched across 130,000 square miles, an ocean of sand dunes that could reach heights of 300 feet and shift position with the winds. The name, which Timur had translated as "go in and you won't come out," reflected hard experience. Entire caravans had vanished without trace, swallowed by sandstorms or led astray by mirages until their water ran out.
The desert crossing required absolute discipline. Water consumption was strictly rationed, with each person allocated approximately 2 liters per day. barely enough to survive in the extreme heat. The camels, remarkably adapted to these conditions, could go for days without water, their humps storing not water, but fat that could be metabolized for energy and moisture. Still, finding regular water sources was critical, and the scouts ranged far ahead, searching for the oases that appeared like emeralds in a vast brown wasteland.
The first oasis, reached after 6 days of hard travel, was a small settlement clustered around a spring that bubbled from underground. The water, slightly alkaline but drinkable, was the most beautiful sight Wei had seen in days. The oasis residents, barely 50 people who lived by serving passing caravans and cultivating small gardens, charged exorbitant prices for fresh food and additional water, but Wei paid without complaint. These oasis communities were the lifeline of Silk Road trade, and alienating them could prove fatal on future journeys.
The dangers Chen had warned about manifested on the 9th day out from Dunhuang. The morning dawned with an eerie stillness, the air heavy and oppressive. The camels grew restless, making anxious sounds and resisting their handlers. Timur studied the horizon with growing alarm. "Sandstorm," he announced tersely. "A bad one. We have perhaps an hour."
Wei immediately ordered the caravan into emergency procedures they had practiced but never expected to use. The camels were forced to kneel and formed into tight groups, their bodies creating windbreaks. The men draped heavy felt blankets over themselves and the animals, creating crude shelters. The most valuable goods were buried in the sand, marked with tall poles so they could be recovered later. Water containers were secured with multiple ropes and covered with oiled cloth.
The storm hit like a physical blow. One moment there was visibility of several miles. The next, the world disappeared into a brown wall of flying sand. The wind shrieked like a living thing, tearing at the felt shelters and forcing sand through every tiny gap. Breathing required covering one's face with cloth and taking small, careful breaths. The temperature dropped dramatically as the sun was blotted out, and the men huddled together for warmth as much as protection.
The storm lasted 18 hours, an eternity during which several men panicked and had to be physically restrained from running into the chaos, where they would have died within minutes. 3 camels broke free and vanished into the maelstrom. 2 men suffered severe injuries when their shoulder collapsed, one breaking his arm, another suffering cuts from flying debris. When the storm finally passed and the caravan emerged, blinking and coughing sand, they found the landscape utterly transformed. Dunes had shifted by hundreds of feet. Landmarks used for navigation had vanished. The trail they had been following was completely erased.
It took hours to dig out the buried goods and reorganize the caravan. The 3 lost camels were never found, representing a significant financial loss. More concerning was the water situation. Several containers had been damaged in the storm, and their remaining supply was now insufficient to reach the next known oasis on their planned route. Timur and the other scouts conferred anxiously, studying the transformed landscape and arguing about directions in their native tongue.
Finally, Timur approached Wei with a proposal. "There is another water source, not on the main route. Smaller, less reliable, but much closer. It's risky. The spring sometimes dries up, but with our water situation, I think we must try." Wei studied his second-in-command's face, seeing genuine concern. Liang nodded slowly. "If we continue to the main oasis and the spring Timur knows is dry, we die. If we try for it and it has water, we live and save 3 days' travel. The odds favor trying."
Wei made the decision, knowing that as caravan master, success or failure, survival or death would be attributed to his leadership. We go to Timur Spring. The scouts led them on a different bearing, navigating by the sun and stars and subtle landscape features invisible to Wei's untrained eyes. The tension in the caravan was palpable as water rations were cut further. Men's lips cracked and bled. The camels, stoic as always, nevertheless showed signs of distress.
On the evening of the 3rd day after the storm, when the water containers were nearly empty and some men had begun to exhibit signs of severe dehydration, Timur gave a shout of triumph. There, in a depression surrounded by rocky outcrops, a small pool of water reflected the setting sun. The spring was indeed flowing, though not abundantly, but it was enough. Men wept with relief, and that night, with water replenished and the immediate crisis past, the caravan's mood shifted from despair to jubilation.
As they rested by the spring,
Wei reflected on how close they had come to disaster and how much depended on knowledge, Temir's intimate understanding of the desert, the scouts' navigational skills, the collective wisdom of generations of traders who had mapped these routes through trial and error and countless lost lives. The Silk Road was not infrastructure in the Roman sense of engineered roads and bridges. It was knowledge, passed merchant to merchant, scout to scout, a mental map of a vast and hostile landscape.
2 weeks later, they reached Kashgar, one of the great oasis cities at the western edge of the Tarim Basin. After the desert crossing, the city seemed like paradise. Fed by rivers flowing from the Tian Shan Mountains, Kashgar was surrounded by orchards and gardens. Its markets overflowed with fruits, vegetables, and the most important commodity of all, fresh, clean water flowing through channels that supplied public fountains and bathhouses. Kashgar's strategic location at the convergence of routes made it a crucial trading hub. Here, the roads from China met routes from India, Persia, and the distant West. The city's population was extraordinarily diverse, and its markets operated in a babel of languages. Sogdian merchants maintained permanent offices here, serving as translators and middlemen. Money changers converted between Chinese copper coins, Persian silver dirhams, and various other currencies. Primitive banking systems had evolved to handle the complexity of long-distance trade, letters of credit that could be redeemed in distant cities, avoiding the need to transport large amounts of precious metals.
Wei established his caravan in one of the city's many caravanserais, fortified compounds that provided secure lodging for merchants and their animals. These institutions, found throughout the Silk Road network, were critical infrastructure that made long-distance trade possible. A typical caravanserai featured a large courtyard where animals could be kept, storage rooms for goods, sleeping quarters for merchants and guards, and often a communal kitchen and bathing facilities. The one Wei chose was owned by a Sogdian named Rozdziały, who had traded with Wei's father and honored the relationship by offering favorable rates.
The negotiation process began immediately. Sogdian merchants arrived to inspect Wei silk, examining the fabric's quality with expert eyes, testing its strength by pulling on threads, holding it up to the light to judge its weave consistency. The ritual of negotiation was elaborate, conducted through translators, even when parties spoke common languages, because the formal structure provided time for consideration and helped prevent misunderstandings that could destroy business relationships.
A particularly skilled Sogdian merchant named Vardan made the first serious offer. Speaking through a translator, he praised the silk's quality, then noted minor imperfections, some sand damage to 3 bolts, slight discoloration in another from moisture exposure. His initial offer was approximately 60% of what Wei hoped to receive. Wei responded by highlighting the silk's exceptional qualities, explaining that it came from the imperial workshops in Chang'an, woven by artisans who supplied the emperor's court. He mentioned casually that Persian merchants had already expressed strong interest and that he was in no hurry to sell.
This dance continued for 3 days, with offers and counteroffers, dramatic gestures of offense and reconciliation, shared meals where business was not mentioned but relationships were strengthened. Other merchants joined the negotiations, creating competition that slowly drove the price upward. Wise patience and refusal to appear desperate eventually yielded results. The final price, while not as high as he had hoped when departing Chang'an, was nonetheless profitable enough to make the journey worthwhile, particularly after accounting for the other goods he would purchase for the return journey.
In exchange for silk, Wei acquired a diverse array of goods. Persian silver worked into elaborate vessels and jewelry would fetch high prices in China. Glass beads in vessels from Roman territories, clear and colored in ways Chinese artisans could not yet replicate, were always in demand. Precious stones from mines in Afghanistan, lapis lazuli, rubies, emeralds, would appeal to wealthy Chinese collectors. Most important for Wei's long-term business strategy were horses. The Han Dynasty's ongoing conflicts with the Xiongnu Confederation had created insatiable demand for cavalry horses, particularly the legendary heavenly horses from the Fergana Valley, larger and stronger than Chinese breeds. Wei negotiated the purchase of 20 horses from a Sogdian braider, paying premium prices for animals with proven bloodlines. These horses would be worth a fortune in Chang'an, assuming they survived the return journey. Horse trading was risky. The animals required far more water than camels, were more susceptible to injury and disease, and attracted bandits like honey attracted flies. But the potential profits justified the risks.
In Kashgar's bazaars, Wei witnessed the cultural fusion that characterized Silk Road cities. A Persian merchant demonstrated glass-blowing techniques to fascinated Chinese observers. Indian monks debated Buddhist philosophy with Chinese pilgrims who had traveled westward seeking authentic scriptures. Sogdian musicians performed on instruments from a dozen traditions, creating hybrid musical forms found nowhere else. Food stalls offered cuisine blending Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Central Asian ingredients and techniques. Cumin and coriander from the West flavoring Chinese-style dumplings, flatbread stuffed with spiced vegetables served alongside rice dishes.
The city's religious diversity was equally striking. Buddhist temples stood near Zoroastrian fire temples and Nestorian Christian churches. Religious tolerance was a practical necessity in a trading city. Merchants might follow different gods, but they all worshipped profit, and religious conflict disrupted commerce. We attended services at a Buddhist temple, making offerings and praying for safe return journey. The temple, like everything in Kashgar, reflected multiple influences. The architecture was fundamentally Chinese, but incorporated Persian domes and Indian decorative elements. The Buddha statues showed Greek sculptural influence in their realistic proportions and flowing robes.
During his time in Kashgar, Wei learned more about the destinations beyond, places he would never visit, but whose existence shaped his commercial calculations. Sogdian merchants who had traveled all the way to Rome described a civilization of astounding wealth and power, with cities larger than Chang'an, engineering marvels like aqueducts that carried water for hundreds of miles, and military might that had conquered the entire Mediterranean region. These Romans, the Sogdians reported, were fascinated by China, which they called Serica, the land of silk. Some Roman philosophers had written about this distant realm, speculating about its people and customs.
What made trade profitable was that neither Romans nor Chinese truly understood each other. Goods passed through so many intermediaries that their origins became mythologized. Romans believed silk grew on trees or came from special sheep. Chinese thought Rome was a minor kingdom somewhere beyond Persia. This mutual ignorance, combined with the vast distances and dangerous journey, created the price differentials that made fortunes possible. A bolt of silk worth perhaps 10 silver coins in Shanghai might sell for several hundred by the time it reached Rome, with each middleman taking a substantial markup.
The goods flowing eastward were equally transformed in value and meaning. Roman glassware, relatively common in Mediterranean cities, became precious luxuries in China. Persian silverwork acquired additional cachet from its exotic origins. This value creation through distance and cultural difference was the fundamental economics of the Silk Road. Merchants weren't just transporting goods, they were transporting rarity, mystery, and the allure of the exotic.
After 2 weeks in Kashgar, Wei made a difficult decision. Rather than continuing westward to Samarkand, as he had originally planned, he would return to China. The sandstorm had delayed them significantly, and autumn was approaching. The mountain passes would soon become impassable with snow, and he had no desire to winter in Central Asia. Moreover, the horses he had purchased required return to China quickly before the harsh conditions took their toll. There would be other journeys westward. For now, returning with solid profits was the prudent choice.
Before departing, Wei visited Rozdziały to settle accounts and maintain their business relationship. Over tea in the Sogdians' private quarters, Rozdziały spoke of the changes he had witnessed in his 40 years of trading. "The routes are busier now than ever," he observed, pouring more tea with the elaborate courtesy that characterized Sogdian hospitality. "When I was young, 2 or 3 major caravans per year was normal. Now dozens pass through Kashgar. The Han Dynasty's expansion westward has stabilized the routes, made them safer. The Xiongnu Confederation is weaker, less able to raid caravans. This is good for business, but I wonder sometimes about the future. If trade continues to grow, will the small merchants be pushed out by larger operations? Will the personal relationships that make this work be replaced by pure commercial calculation?" Wei found the Sogdians' concerns prescient. Already he had heard of larger trading operations being organized, with multiple caravans operating simultaneously and permanent representatives stationed in key cities. The entrepreneurial model he represented, individual merchant risking his own capital on a single journey, might indeed become obsolete. But for now, there was still room for skilled, knowledgeable traders who understood both the commercial and cultural dimensions of Silk Road trade.
The return journey to Chang'an took nearly 4 months, following a more northerly route that avoided the worst of the Taklamakan Desert. The caravan moved more slowly now, burdened with the horses and the need to find adequate grazing for them. They stopped at Turpan, an oasis depression below sea level, where intense heat made summer travel nearly impossible, but autumn weather was pleasant. The city's irrigation systems, underground channels called carets that prevented water evaporation in the intense heat, were engineering marvels that allowed agriculture in seemingly impossible conditions.
As they traveled eastward through the Hexi corridor, Wei reflected on how the journey had changed him. He had departed Chang'an thinking purely in terms of profit and loss, risks and rewards. He returned with a broader understanding of the Silk Road's significance. Yes, it was a commercial network that made fortunes possible, but it was also the mechanism by which human civilization was discovering its own interconnectedness. Ideas, technologies, religions, artistic styles, scientific knowledge, even diseases, all traveled these routes along with silk and spices.
Buddhism's transformation as it traveled from India to China illustrated this cultural exchange. The religion had been substantially modified to make it compatible with Chinese philosophical traditions like Confucianism and Taoism. Chinese Buddhists emphasized different sutras than Indian Buddhists, interpreted key concepts through Chinese cultural lenses, and developed unique practices in schools of thought. This wasn't corruption of original Buddhism, but creative adaptation, the religion evolving as it encountered new cultural contexts.
Similarly, technologies flowed in both directions. Papermaking, a Chinese invention, would eventually spread westward, transforming literacy and record-keeping throughout Asia and eventually Europe. Glassmaking techniques, well developed in Rome and Persia, would be learned and adapted by Chinese artisans. Metallurgy, agriculture, textile production, in every field, knowledge crossed borders and cultures, usually carried by merchants more interested in profit than cultural exchange, but nevertheless serving as vectors of innovation.
The caravan reached Chang'an in late autumn, the city preparing for winter. Wei's return was not celebrated with fanfare. He was one merchant among hundreds conducting similar business, but his family welcomed him joyfully, having feared they might never see him again. The horses sold quickly and profitably to military buyers. The Persian silver found eager purchasers among wealthy officials and merchants. The glass and gemstones were acquired by collectors and jewelry makers. When Wei calculated his final profits, accounting for all expenses, including the 3 camels lost in the sandstorm, he had nearly doubled his initial investment, an excellent return that would fund an even larger caravan in the spring.
But Wei found himself thinking less about profit and more about the journey itself, the people he had met, the cultures he had glimpsed. The Sogdian translator in Kashgar who spoke 5 languages fluently and could discuss Buddhist philosophy, Persian poetry, and Chinese history with equal facility. The Indian monk at Dunhuang who had traveled for 3 years to reach China seeking authentic Buddhist scriptures. The old merchant Chen who had spent his entire adult life moving between worlds, belonging fully to none, but welcomed in all. These people were the true Silk Road, the human threads connecting empires and civilizations.
One evening, as Wei stood on the walls of Chang'an watching the sun set over the western deserts he had crossed, his young son approached and asked about the journey. Wei found himself telling not the story he had planned, a tale of commercial triumph and cunning negotiations, but something different. He spoke of the desert's terrible beauty, the way sandstorms could reshape the world overnight, the miracle of finding water after days of thirst. He described Kashgar's markets, where people from a dozen nations traded in a dozen languages, united by commerce and mutual need. He explained how silk from their city connected to Roman senators and Persian kings, how their lives touched distant people they would never meet.
"Is that why you travel, father?" his son asked. "To meet these people and see these places?" We considered the question carefully. "I traveled to earn money for our family, to build our fortune," he answered honestly. "But yes, also to see and learn. The world is much larger and stranger than anyone in this city realizes. Every journey teaches me that human beings, no matter how different they seem, share common needs and hopes. We all seek prosperity and security for our families. We all wonder about distant places and different people. Trade connects us, makes us dependent on each other. The Silk Road is not just about silk. It's about discovering that we're all part of something larger than our own kingdom, our own culture.
As autumn turned to winter and Wei began planning his next caravan, he reflected on the Silk Road's future. The routes had existed in various forms for centuries and would continue for centuries more, until eventually ocean trade routes would make them less critical. But for now, in this moment of history, these threads of commerce and culture connecting East and West represented humanity's primary mechanism for long-distance connection. Empires rose and fell, kingdoms fragmented and reformed, but the trade routes persisted, adapting to new political realities while maintaining their essential function.
The Silk Road was not infrastructure in stone and wood, but something more ephemeral and enduring, a network of knowledge, relationships, and shared interest that transcended political boundaries. It existed in the minds of merchants who knew the routes, in the trust between trading partners separated by thousands of miles, in the relay system that allowed goods to cross continents. It was humanity's first truly global network, primitive compared to what would come, but revolutionary in its time.
Wei Zhao never made it to Rome, never saw the Mediterranean Sea or the great cities of the West. But the silk he traded reached those destinations, carried by Sogdian middlemen and Persian merchants, each taking their profit and passing the goods along. And in this way, he connected his world to distant realms, his labor contributing to the vast human project of interconnection that defined the Silk Road. In the bustling markets of Chang'an and Kashgar, in the desperate struggle for survival in the Taklamakan Desert, in the quiet satisfaction of a successful negotiation, Wei had found his place in the great chain of commerce and culture that bound the ancient world together. The threads of silk, delicate yet strong, became metaphors for the bonds between civilizations, fragile but enduring, precious beyond their mere material value.
Chapter 2. The Incense Route. Perfuming Ancient Worlds.
The dawn broke over the Dhofar Mountains like molten copper poured across jagged peaks, illuminating a landscape so harsh and beautiful that it seemed to exist outside of time itself. Here, in the southmost reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, in the ancient land of Punt that would later be known as Yemen and Oman, the most precious commodity in the ancient world grew from twisted, tortured trees clinging to limestone cliffs. These were the Boswellia sacra and Commiphora myrrha, the frankincense and myrrh trees that would build kingdoms, fuel religious fervor across continents, and create one of history's most legendary trade routes. Jabal ibn Rashid stood at the edge of a precipice, surveying the grove his family had tended for 17 generations. The morning light revealed dozens of frankincense trees scattered across the mountainside, their swollen trunks and sparse foliage appearing almost grotesque against the austere beauty of the desert mountains. Each tree represented wealth beyond the imagination of ordinary men. A single pound of the finest frankincense resin could purchase a healthy slave in the markets of Memphis, or buy a month's grain supply for a large household in Rome. The trees before him collectively held the value of a small kingdom, yet they grew in one of the most inhospitable places on earth, as if the gods themselves had hidden this treasure where only the most determined could reach it. The harvesting season had arrived, that narrow window between late spring and early summer when the trees could be tapped for their precious sap. Jabal descended the rocky slope with the practiced ease of someone who had made this journey since childhood, his feet finding purchase on stones worn smooth by centuries of harvesters before him. He carried the tools of his trade, a mingoff, a traditional curved blade sharp enough to slice through bark without damaging the vital wood beneath, leather pouches treated with beeswax to protect the resin from moisture, and a small clay vessel containing sheep's fat used to seal the cuts and prevent infection in the trees.
The process of harvesting frankincense was both art and science, knowledge passed down through oral tradition with the weight of religious ritual. Jabal approached the first tree with the reverence his father had taught him, placing his palm against the pale bark and whispering a prayer of gratitude. The tree had already been prepared weeks earlier with shallow test cuts, allowing the sap to begin its journey to the surface. Now he would make the true harvest incisions, careful horizontal slashes spaced precisely along the trunk, deep enough to penetrate to the sapwood, but not so deep as to harm the tree's life force. The blade kissed bark, and immediately the tree began to bleed.
Clear, sticky resin oozed from the wound, a tear of liquid gold that would harden over the coming weeks into the translucent amber chunks so prized by priests, physicians, and perfumers across the ancient world. This first exudate, however, would not be collected. The initial bleeding was inferior, contaminated with bark particles and impurities. This preliminary resin would be allowed to fall away, and only the second and third bleedings, pure, aromatic, and luminous, would be gathered for the trade routes. The finest frankincense, known as silver for its pale, almost white appearance, came from later harvests and commanded prices that made even wealthy merchants gasp. By midday, Jabal had tapped 43 trees, each now weeping its precious tears under the punishing sun. The scent that filled the mountain air was intoxicating, sweet yet sharp, woody yet somehow ethereal, a fragrance that seemed to bridge the earthly and the divine. It was no wonder, Jabal reflected, that every major civilization valued this substance above almost all others. The Egyptians used it to embalm their pharaohs, believing it necessary for the journey to the afterlife. The Babylonians burned it in massive quantities in their ziggurat temples. The Hebrews included it in the sacred Ketoret incense formula ordained by their god. The Greeks and Romans consumed it voraciously, burning it at funerals, using it in religious ceremonies, and wearing it as personal perfume. The demand seemed inexhaustible, and the supply was controlled by a fortunate few who lived in these remote mountains.
3 weeks later, Jabal returned to collect the hardened tears. The resin had solidified into irregular chunks and droplets, ranging from the size of a lentil to occasionally a man's fist. He carefully removed each piece with wooden scrapers, never touching the resin with bare hands. The oil from human skin could diminish its quality and alter its burning characteristics. The lumps were sorted immediately by color and clarity. The pale, translucent pieces went into leather pouches lined with fine linen. The darker, more opaque resin was collected separately, still valuable but destined for less discriminating markets or for processing into incense powder. Even the lowest grade of frankincense was worth more than most men earned in a month of hard labor. As Jabal worked, his eldest son Zafir climbed the mountain path, bringing news from the valley below. A Nabatean merchant caravan had arrived in their village, assembling in preparation for the long journey north to the Mediterranean. The caravan master, a legendary trader named Obadas, who had made the journey more than 50 times in his long career, was buying frankincense and myrrh for the markets of Petra, Damascus, and ultimately Alexandria. He was offering premium prices, having arrived before most of the other merchants, and he had the reputation of paying honestly and in silver rather than the trade goods that many merchants used to mask unfavorable exchange rates. Jabal felt the familiar mixture of emotions that this news always brought. The arrival of the great caravans meant wealth for his family, the conversion of their year's labor into tangible reward. But it also meant engaging with the vast, complex, and often dangerous world beyond these mountains, the world of professional traders, powerful kingdoms, distant peoples, and the intricate web of commerce that connected southern Arabia to lands so far away that their names seemed like myths.
The descent to the valley took most of the day, with Jabal and Zafir carrying loads of resin that represented their family's entire harvest. The best pieces, nearly 12 pounds of silver-grade frankincense, were in Jabal's pack. Even this relatively modest quantity was worth a fortune, enough to purchase land, livestock, and provide marriage dowries for daughters, enough to elevate a family's status for generations. The weight on his back was not just physical, but psychological, the accumulated effort of a year's work, the hopes of his family, the continuation of an ancestral tradition.
Chapter 3. Viking Networks, From Frozen North to Baghdad's Splendor.
The spring morning arrived cold and bright over the Norwegian fjord, painting the snow-capped peaks with shades of rose and gold. Ottar stood at the wooden pier, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as he surveyed the longship that would carry him on a journey of thousands of miles. Unlike the sleek warships designed for raids that had made his people infamous across Christian Europe, this vessel was broader of beam, built for cargo rather than speed, though still displaying the elegant lines that made Norse shipbuilding the envy of the known world. The ship's shallow draft would prove essential for the journey ahead, allowing navigation of both open seas and the intricate river systems that connected the frozen north to the markets of the east. At 40 winters, Ottar was considered old by Viking standards, his beard streaked with silver, his hands scarred from decades of handling ropes and weapons alike.
But those same hands had also counted silver dirhams, evaluated silk quality, and negotiated prices in half a dozen languages. He was a merchant prince of sorts, commanding respect in his coastal settlement not through battle prowess alone, but through the wealth his trading voyages brought home. The younger men who would crew his vessel looked to him with a mixture of awe and aspiration, for Ottar had seen what most Norsemen could only imagine: cities larger than anything in Scandinavia, markets where goods from 3 continents changed hands, and civilizations that made their northern settlements seem primitive by comparison. The preparations for departure had consumed weeks. This was no raid that could be mounted in days, requiring only weapons, warriors, and sufficient provisions to reach a target coast. Trade expeditions demanded different resources entirely. The cargo space of Ottar's ship was carefully organized with goods that would increase in value the farther south and east they traveled. Bundled furs took up significant space, fox, beaver, and marten pelts, but most precious were the sable and ermine from the far northern reaches, so dark and lustrous they seemed to absorb light. These Arctic furs, unobtainable in warmer lands, commanded extraordinary prices in markets where summer heat made such luxurious warmth an exotic indulgence for the wealthy. Walrus ivory, carefully wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from moisture, represented another crucial trade commodity. Since the Islamic world prohibited the representation of living creatures in religious art, elephant ivory was less commonly imported from Africa and India, making the creamy tusks from northern seas particularly valuable. Ottar had secured a dozen prime tusks, each representing dangerous hunting expeditions into Arctic waters where walrus herds gathered on ice floes. The ivory would be carved by craftsmen in distant cities into chess pieces, decorative boxes, and ornamental inlays that graced the palaces of caliphs and emirs. Amber was loaded in smaller chests, golden translucent chunks collected from Baltic shores, where ancient forests had fossilized into gems. The Arabs called it karaba, valuing it for both ornamental and supposed medicinal properties. Mixed with the amber were smaller quantities of specialized goods: whetstones of Norwegian ragstone, prized for their superior quality in sharpening blades, dried fish that could sustain travelers for months, fragrant pinewood tar used for waterproofing, and finely woven wool textiles in patterns unique to northern looms. More controversial was the human cargo. Chained near the stern were 15 slaves, men, women, and a few children, captured in raids or purchased from Slavic tribes who themselves had taken prisoners in their own conflicts. The slave trade was among the most profitable aspects of Viking commerce, and while some Norse merchants expressed qualms about the practice, economic reality overshadowed moral considerations. These captives would be sold in eastern markets, where the demand for slaves from northern lands was constant, the fair-skinned men prized as guards and warriors, the women as concubines and domestic servants. Ottar tried not to look at their faces, focusing instead on the practical aspects of keeping them healthy enough to command good prices. A merchant who allowed his cargo to sicken was a poor businessman, regardless of the nature of that cargo. The crew Ottar had assembled numbered 30 men, not warriors primarily, though all could fight if necessary, but skilled specialists essential for a trading expedition. There were experienced sailors who could read weather and stars, linguists who spoke Finnish, Slavic languages, and some Arabic, a blacksmith for repairs, 2 men who had made this journey before and knew the crucial portage routes between river systems, and young apprentices learning the trade. Unlike a raiding party where courage and battle skill were paramount, a successful trading voyage required diplomacy, patience, cultural adaptability, and the ability to negotiate rather than simply take. As the morning sun climbed higher, Ottar performed the traditional offerings to ensure safe passage. At the small wooden shrine overlooking the harbor, he placed bread, ale, and a silver armoring, murmuring prayers to Thor for protection on the journey and to Njord for calm seas. Though he had heard tales of the one god worshipped out Christians and Muslims, and had even attended church services in trading ports where it proved diplomatically useful, his heart remained with the old gods of his ancestors. The rituals completed, he gave the order to embark. The ship slid smoothly into the dark water, oars dipping in synchronized rhythm as the crew rowed toward the fjord's mouth. The settlement behind them grew smaller, wooden longhouses with turf roofs, smoke rising from cooking fires, children and women waving farewell from the shore. Some of these farewells were final. Not all trading expeditions returned, claimed by storms, disease, hostile peoples, or simple misfortune in lands far from home. But the potential rewards justified the risks. A successful journey could make a man wealthy enough to purchase land, attract advantageous marriage alliances, and elevate his family's status for generations. Once past the coastal islands, the ship turned eastward, following the familiar route along the Norwegian and Swedish coasts. The Norse had been sailing these waters for centuries, every rock and current known to experienced sailors. But this was merely the beginning, the safe prelude to the journey's true challenges. They stopped at coastal settlements to take on additional supplies, and recruit 2 more crew members who had specialized knowledge of the Baltic approaches. The network of Norse traders extended along these coasts, information exchanged about conditions to the east, which rivers were passable, which local rulers were currently friendly to foreign merchants, where recent conflicts made certain routes too dangerous. The Baltic Sea, when they reached it after days of coastal sailing, presented a different character than the Norwegian Sea, shallower, more enclosed.
its moods sometimes gentler, but its sudden storms equally treacherous. The ship sailed past the Swedish coast, past the island of Gotland, where merchants from across the Baltic gathered in seasonal markets, past the entrances to numerous rivers flowing from the eastern lands. Their destination was the Gulf of Finland, gateway to the river routes penetrating deep into the territories the Norse called Gardariki, the realm of fortified towns that would eventually become the foundation of Russian civilization. At the mouth of the Never River, Ottar guided his ship into fresh water, the crew changing from sea sailing to river navigation techniques. The landscape transformed from open water to dense forests pressing close to both banks, pine and birch trees creating walls of green, broken occasionally by clearings where Pinnic peoples had established small settlements. These tribes, Veps, Ingrians, and Kerleus, were neither enemies nor full allies, but essential components of the trade network. They supplied furs trapped in the vast forests, provided local knowledge and guides, and offered portage services for the most difficult passages. The first major stop was Alda-Gieblak, the trading settlement the Slavs called Ladoga, where the Volkhov River began its journey southward toward Lake Helmand and eventually connected to the great river systems flowing to the Caspian Sea. Here, Ottar's ship joined a small flotilla of entrants, some Norse-built, others of Slavic or Finnic construction. The settlement bustled with commercial activity, merchant compounds with warehouses, workshops where craftsmen produced goods for trade, taverns where sailors exchanged information and rumors, slave markets where human merchandise was displayed and evaluated. Ottar negotiated with a Finnic trader for additional furs, each examining each pelt carefully for quality, checking for damage or poor curing of Percute's value. The trader spoke a mixture, as native Latvian and Norse, prices discussed through complex calculations involving various currencies, Havik silver dirhams, Byzantine louis air coins, armed mix of measured silver that could be cut into smaller pieces, and simple parter. The transaction consumed hours, accompanied by a ritual consumption of hail and formalized phrases of respect. To rush such negotiations or show impatient would be insulting, marking one as an amateur unworthy of serious business. The settlement also provided an opportunity to gather intelligence about conditions ahead. Other merchants returning from eastern journeys reported that the Khazar Khanate was currently stable, trade routes through their territory secure for those who paid proper tolls. The Bulgar-Bulgas were welcoming merchants, their market at the Great Bend of the Bulgar River thriving. Most importantly, Baghdad remained open to northern traders, the Abbasid Caliphate under Caliph al-Mamun continuing the cosmopolitan policies that made the capital a magnet for commerce from China to Spain. Such information was invaluable. Political instability could close routes for years, wars could make entire regions impassable, and a merchant who ventured in chaos might lose everything. From Ladoga, the route continued south along the Volkhov River to Lake Ilmen, and then to the settlement of Holmgard, which the Slavs called Novgard, the new city. Here the Norse presence was even more pronounced, an entire district of the city dominated by Scandinavian merchants who'd established permanent compounds, married local women, and begun the cultural blending that would eventually create the Rus people. The term Rus itself derived from the Finnish word for Swedes, Ransi, gradually applied to the Norse merchants and warriors who had penetrated these eastern lands and established themselves as a ruling elite over Slavic populations. Novgard impressed Ottar every time he visited. Unlike the scattered farmsteads and small settlements typical of Norway, this was a true city with thousands of inhabitants, wooden fortifications surrounding dense clusters of buildings, churches with onion domes reflecting Byzantine influence, and a commercial district where merchants from a dozen peoples conduct business. The market stretched along the riverside, stalls and temporary structures offering goods from across the known world. Finnic furs and forest products occupied one section, Slavic honey, wax, and grain another, while luxury goods from the east, silks, spices, glassware, fine weapons, commanded the premium locations. The multicultural character of the market fascinated Ottar even after many visits. The Norse traders in their distinctive clothing mingled with Slavic merchants in embroidered tunics, Finnic tribesmen wrapped in furs, Khazar representatives in long robes and distinctive headwear, and occasionally even merchants from farther east, with features and clothing completely foreign to European eyes. Languages blended into a polyglot hum. Old Norse, various Slavic dialects, Finnic languages, Turkic tongues, Byzantine, and Arabic francs from those who had happily tools from the caliphates. Ottar established his crew at one of the merging compounds, paying for warehouse space to secure their goods and accommodations for his men. The slaves were housed separately, chains were divided adequate to shelter, damaged goods commanded lower prices. While his crew rested and enjoyed the city's taverns and entertainments, Ottar spent days in negotiations, selling some of its cargoes to local merchants who would redistribute it to regional markets, while carefully preserving the most valuable items for the ultimate destination of Baghdad. He also recruited additional personnel essential for the next phase of the journey. The route ahead involves portage in between river systems. Backbreaking labor requires a strong backs and knowledge of the additional crowds. Local Slavic labor specialize in this work, and many payment in silver or goods for their services. Ottar also hired 2 guides who knew river systems deeply, including the locations of rapids, hostile settles, and safe digging spots. A translator fluent in both Slavic languages and the Turkic tongue of the Khazar joined the expedition. His linguistic skills potentially were more than physical cargo. The departure from Novgorod began the expedition up the Volkhov River, a small waterway requiring both rowing and poling to make progress against the current. The labor was exhausting, men rotating through positions as they drove the hip upstream through forested landscapes dotted with small agricultural settlements. The Slavic villages lost them past with wary familiarity. The Norse were traders, yes, but also raiders who had attracted, treated, and taken slaves in previous generations. The relationship remained complex, mixing mutual economic benefit, underlying tensions, and occasional bias. The first major departure came after the use of river travel, reaching a point where the low-cost could get impossible, and the expedition needed to transfer to a different river system following off the lead. The portage route was one path through the foreign part counter strike in their vessels and cargo, but established with 3 men in the choice cutter. The ship would be partially reducing its weight enough for teams of men to haul it on wooden rollers across several miles of uneven terrain. The cargo is transported separately, heavy bundles carried on backs or dragged on sledges, multiple trips required to move everything. Ottar watched his crew strain and sweat, muscles corded with effort, clothing soaked with perspiration despite the cool forest air. This was the unglamorous reality of Viking trade, not glorious battles or easy plunder, but back-breaking physical labor sustained over days and weeks. The Slavic porters worked alongside them, experienced techniques that minimized damage to ships and cargo. They sang rhythmic work songs in their language, the repetitive melodies helping coordinate effort as they hauled the civical hair over logs, adjusting its position when it threatened.
Campfires at night during the portage brought the diverse expedition together. Men from different peoples shared food, exchanged stories through translation and gesture, and performed the small rituals that transformed a collection of individuals into a functioning team. Ottar's blacksmith repaired tools damaged during the day's work. The cook prepared simple but substantial meals from preserved foods, supplemented with fish caught in nearby streams and occasional game. Guards posted at the camp perimeter watched for threats, bandits who might target vulnerable traders, wild animals, or hostile locals. One evening, a young Norwegian crew member named Thorvald approached Ottar at the fire, curiosity evident on his face. This was the youth's first trading expedition, and the reality differed significantly from his expectations. "Is it always like this?" he asked, gesturing at the exhausted men and the partially transported cargo. "The songs make it sound glorious, but this is just hard work." Ottar smiled, remembering his own first journey decades earlier, his own disillusionment when adventure proved to be mostly labor and discomfort. "The songs lie, or at least exaggerate," he replied. "They speak of battles and treasure because those make good stories. They don't mention portages, negotiations, or the tedious business of keeping accounts and managing cargo. But I'll tell you truly, Thorvald, a successful trading voyage requires more skill and brings more lasting wealth than a raid. Raiders take what others have built. Merchants create value through exchange. We connect worlds, bringing goods from where they're common to where they're rare, and everyone benefits. That's a kind of magic the Skalds don't celebrate enough." Reaching the tributary that would take them to the Dnieper River was a relief after days of portaging. The ship floated once more, cargo reloaded, crew recovering from their exertions as they let the current carry them downstream. The Dnieper was one of the great rivers of Eastern Europe, flowing from northern forests through the steppelands to the Black Sea. Norse traders had established a route down this river to the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople's magnificent markets providing an alternative destination to the eastern path Ottar was following. But Ottar's destination lay east, not south. At the settlement of Gnestevo, another major trading center, the expedition transferred to the route that would take them towards the Volga River system. This required another portage, though shorter than the first, and then navigation of smaller rivers and lakes that formed a watery highway through the forests. The settlements grew more scattered, the landscape less familiar even to experienced travelers. They were entering regions where Norse presence was less established, where local tribes viewed foreign traders with greater suspicion. An encounter with a Slavic prince's representative illustrated the diplomatic complexities of long-distance trade. The official, accompanied by armed guards, intercepted the expedition at a narrow point in the river, demanding to see authorization for passage through his lord's territory. Ottar produced documents, pieces of parchment with wax seals, acquired during previous journeys, affirming his status as a merchant with safe passage rights granted by various rulers. But documents meant little without negotiation. The official expected tribute, payment for the privilege of crossing lands under his prince's control. The negotiation unfolded with careful formality. Ottar presented gifts, a fine fur, a small amount of amber, a decorated knife, while explaining his peaceful intentions and emphasizing the mutual benefits of allowing commerce to flow freely. The official examined the gifts, their quality and generosity, while assessing Ottar's demeanor and the strength of his crew. Too weak an expedition invited plunder rather than taxation. Too strong suggested trouble not worth the effort. Finding the balance, the official accepted the tribute, provided fresh documents with his lord's seal, and even offered information about conditions ahead, a recent tribal conflict that made one route dangerous, an alternative path that was currently safer. Such encounters occurred repeatedly as the expedition penetrated deeper into the network of small kingdoms, tribal territories, and shifting alliances that characterized Eastern Europe. Each ruler or chieftain controlled certain river sections or portage routes. Each demanded their share of passing trade. These payments were substantial, cutting significantly into profit margins, but they were the price of commerce. The alternative, trying to force passage or sneak through, risked violence that could destroy an expedition entirely. Successful merchants understood that paying tolls, following protocols, and building relationships was simply part of business. Reaching the Volga River system was a significant milestone. This mighty river, one of Europe's longest, flowed from northern forests through diverse regions to the Caspian Sea. The Volga trade route connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world, a commercial highway that moved goods, people, ideas, and culture across thousands of miles. Norse merchants had been sailing these waters for over a century, establishing trading posts, intermarrying with local populations, and creating the foundation for what would become medieval Russia. The expedition followed the Volga downstream, no longer fighting against current but flowing with it, making substantially better time. The landscape gradually changed as northern forests gave way to more open terrain. Settlements along the banks showed increasing diversity.
Slavic agricultural villages, Finnic fishing communities, and increasingly signs of the Turkic peoples who dominated the Middle Volga region. These were the lands of the Volga Bulgars, a Khanate that had emerged as a major commercial power by controlling the strategic middle section of the river. The Bulgar capital, located at a great bend in the river, was Otter's next major destination. Here, a market of international significance operated during summer months, attracting merchants from across northern Eurasia. The city itself impressed with its size and sophistication, wooden fortifications protecting substantial populations, mosques indicating the Islamic faith the Bulgars had adopted, markets organized by commodity type, and warehouses storing goods awaiting redistribution. This was where northern products from Scandinavia and the Baltic met goods from the Islamic world traveling up from the Caspian, creating opportunities for exchange that benefited all parties. Otter spent weeks in the Volga market, the pace of commerce here more leisurely than in the northern settlements. Merchants established temporary residences, displaying goods, negotiating deals, attending social events where business relationships were cultivated over shared meals. The market operated according to protocols influenced by commercial law, contracts formalized with documentation, standards for weights and measures enforced, disputes adjudicated by appointed judges. For a Norse trader accustomed to simpler exchange practices, the sophistication required adjustment, but also provided greater security than informal arrangements. Here, Otter sold significant portions of his cargo to Bulgar intermediaries who would redistribute the goods through their own networks. The furs, amber, and walrus ivory found eager buyers, paid for primarily in silver terriers in Baghdad and other Islamic cities. The flow of these points northward was enormous. Archaeologists in modern times would discover hordes of tens of thousands of Arabic coins across Scandinavia, evidence of the trade network scale. Otter also purchased goods to carry south, the Bulgar letter highly regarded in Baghdad, slaves additions to his human cargo, and letters of introduction to merchants in the Caliphate capital. The journey continued down the Bulgar towards the Caspian Sea, passing through territories controlled by the Khazar Khanate, another Turkic state that dominated the lower Bulgar and the northern Caucasus region. The Khazars were more directly connected to Byzantine and Islamic spheres, their ruling elite having controversially converted into Judaism, creating a unique situation where a Turkic kingdom adopted the faith of neither Christian, Byzantine, nor Muslim Arabic neighbors. For merchants, Khazar's policies matter primarily regarding trade security and taxation levels, but a Khazar checkpoint officials carefully inspect cargo, assessed appropriate tools, and provided documentation ensuring safe passage through Khazar territories. The process was bureaucratic, for efforts capped on enlargement, fees, standardized copy and edge schedules, and officials who seemed more like administrators than warriors. Pilot paid required silver, received the necessary favors, and goods makes the expedition of the Castro Callisto. Lunch services were optional, but they did provide genuine security, and its rarely attacked caravans that created Khazar protection. Reaching the Caspian Sea opened the final haze of the journey. The expedition transferred to larger vessels suitable for sea travel, part of a small fleet making crossings to Severn Shore. The Caspian, despite being landlocked, to be treacherous, its mood shifting from calm to violent storms with little warning. The crossing took several days. The ships gave and separated each other, crews nervously watching weather signs and praying to their respective gods for safe passage. Landfall on the Solent shore brought them into territories directly controlled by the Abbasid Caliphate. The landscape changed dramatically from home, lots of steps to gain the air and time, vegetation different in character, the heat more intense than anything experienced in Scandinavia. The local population was profoundly Persian and Arabic. Their clothing, architecture, and customs reflected Islamic civilization at its height, but the younger Dhofars proved the cultural shock was profound. The final approach to Baghdad followed caravan routes, the expedition joining a larger group of merchants traveling under Ahmad's escort. The roads here were maintained at standards unknown in the north, way stations providing a foundation of security carried regular intervals, the infrastructural and sophisticated state-of-the-art credits, signs of prosperity free everywhere, irrigated agricultural fields producing unstopping crops, towns dependent cities numerously and enough densely populated North Filia. In summer areas bustling with commercial activity, Otter felt his own anticipated joy, despite having missed his journey twice before. Baghdad was unlike every else in a city that embodies the cosmopolitan brilliance of the Timbuktu, founded less than a century earlier like capital of Alstom, sitting around hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, making it one of the largest urban centers on Earth. Its house of wisdom attracted scholars across the known world. Its markets offered goods manufactured to Spain. Its architecture treats lighter treatments and there's a chance that the city's most conceived from by comparison. The first view of Baghdad came from a slight rise as the caravan approached from the north. The famous round city appeared starting off fortifications enforcing the government history of the corrupt mosque and having no louds. The geological perfection of the site was visible even from miles away. The walls forming precise circles and different estimates of sections to find about city. The great power of the history is long of the next specific sports to fight the acquisitions. The site makes the fairness of the presentation. It is that these roads are such as to be extremely hard to establish the station of here. The sensory outcome is overwhelming. Its emphasis is not an experience in part. Its smells were complex and often pleasant. Its lighting was fast on the same sense of the traffic. My several
Most striking was the sheer number of people. Baghdad's population exceeded anything in Europe outside Constantinople. Streets thronged with crowds, merchants and customers, officials and servants, scholars and students, craftsmen and laborers, beggars and the wealthy, representatives of dozens of ethnicities and peoples from across the Islamic world and beyond. Chinese merchants had traveled the Silk Road to Baghdad. Indian traders brought goods from the subcontinent. Africans from south of the Sahara traded ivory and gold. Jews and Christians lived in protected communities with their own districts and religious freedom. Attar's expedition made its way to the merchant district designated for foreign traders, particularly those from the north. Here, a small community of Rus merchants maintained compounds, the buildings Persian in style, but the inhabitants speaking Slavic and Norse languages, following a mixture of Islamic, Christian, and traditional pagan practices. Attar had connections from previous visits, merchant relationships built over years. He was welcomed into a compound, given warehouse space for his goods and accommodations for his crew. The slaves were taken to the slave market, a district where human beings were bought and sold with the same commercial practices applied to any commodity. Attar supervised the process, ensuring his captives were properly presented to maximize their value. The market was disturbingly efficient, buyers examining the merchandise with clinical detachment, checking teeth, muscles, and overall health, asking about skills and temperament. The fair-skinned northerners attracted significant interest, their exotic appearance commanding premium prices. Within days, all were sold, the silver counted and secured. With that grim business concluded, Attar turned to the more pleasant aspects of commerce. The luxury goods market in Baghdad was staggering in its variety. Silk arrived from China in dozens of qualities and colors, the finest fabrics almost translucent, dyed with pigments that produced colors impossible to achieve with northern dyes. Weapons from Damascus featured steel of legendary quality, blades that could flex without breaking and held edges sharper than anything produced in Scandinavia. Jewelry displayed craftsmanship of extraordinary sophistication, intricate filigree work, gems from across Asia, pearls from the Persian Gulf, designs showing influence from Persian, Indian, and even Chinese traditions. Spices were perhaps the most exotic goods to northern tastes. Pepper from India was available in quantities unimaginable in Europe, where it was worth its weight in silver. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, cardamom, saffron, flavors completely foreign to Viking palates, but highly valued by those few who had tasted them. These spices were expensive even in Baghdad. Transporting them north would increase their value exponentially, but their weight-to-value ratio made them attractive trade goods despite the risks of spoilage during long journeys. Attar spent weeks in negotiations, visiting different markets and merchant compounds, comparing prices and qualities, building relationships with Arabic and Persian traders. The commercial culture required patience and ritual, sharing tea or sherbet before discussing business, inquiring about family and health, exchanging information about conditions in different markets, only gradually approaching actual negotiations. Rushing was considered rude, suggesting desperation or lack of sophistication. Successful merchants understood that relationships mattered as much as individual transactions. One evening, Attar was invited to dine at the home of a prominent Arab merchant named Khalil ibn Rahman, whose family had traded throughout the Abbasid realm for generations. The merchant's house exemplified Baghdad's prosperity, a substantial structure built around a central courtyard with a fountain, rooms decorated with carpets and cushions, walls featuring tilework in complex geometric patterns. Servants brought courses of food unlike anything served in Norse halls: rice prepared with spices and dried fruits, lamb roasted with herbs, vegetables cooked in ways that enhanced rather than obliterated their flavors, sweets made with honey, nuts, and exotic ingredients, all accompanied by fruit juices and sherbet, since wine was forbidden by Islamic law. Through interpreters, the two merchants exchanged stories. Khalil was fascinated by descriptions of the far north, lands where winter darkness lasted months, seas that froze solid, the aurora borealis dancing across night skies. Attar was equally amazed by Khalil's accounts of trade missions to India, descriptions of monsoon rains and tropical heat, of cities even larger than Baghdad, of religions and philosophies completely different from anything in Europe or the Islamic world. Both men recognized their common humanity, despite vast cultural differences, bonded by the shared experience of commerce across vast distances. The conversation turned philosophical. Khalil asked why the Rus continued raiding Christian lands when trade proved more profitable. Attar considered the question carefully. Our people are warriors by tradition, he explained. Battle brings glory that trade doesn't. A successful raid enriches the raiders quickly, while trade requires years of patient work. Young men want adventure and fame, not the tedious business of portaging between rivers and negotiating prices. But I've learned that while raids bring temporary wealth, trade networks create lasting prosperity. Every successful voyage strengthens relationships, builds reputation, creates connections that benefit future expeditions. I can trade here because merchants trust me based on past dealings. That trust is worth more than any raid's plunder. Khalil nodded thoughtfully. The Quran teaches that commerce is blessed, while thievery is forbidden. Trade creates mutual benefit. I gain goods rare in my market, you gain goods rare in yours, and everyone prospers. Raiding creates only resentment and revenge. Your people would benefit from embracing commerce more fully, abandoning the warrior traditions that bring only temporary gain. Attar couldn't fully agree. Warrior culture was too deeply embedded in Norse identity to abandon, but he recognized the wisdom in Khalil's perspective. Younger Attar had gloried in raids, but decades of experience had shown him that merchants who built trading networks became wealthier and more secure than warriors whose fortunes depended on battle luck. The future, he suspected, belonged to commerce more than conquest.
though convincing his people of this would require generations of cultural change. Before leaving Baghdad, Attar visited some of the city's famous sites. The Great Mosque of Al-Mansur was open to non-Muslims outside prayer times, its scale and beauty leaving it speechless. The central courtyard could hold thousands of worshippers, columns supporting a roof that seemed impossibly high, decorative elements demonstrating artistic sophistication far beyond anything in Scandinavian churches. The House of Wisdom, where scholars from different cultures collaborated on translating and expanding humanities knowledge, impressed him even more. Here, Greek philosophical texts were being translated into Arabic, Indian mathematical treatises studied, astronomical observations recorded, the intellectual vitality making clear that civilization encompassed more than military power. The return journey would follow the same route in Diverse, but Attar would travel lighter and wealthier. His ship's cargo hold, which had carried furs and amber south, would carry silk and spices north. The silver dirhams earned from selling slaves and goods weighed heavy but compact. He had letters of introduction to new trading partners, information about market conditions, and strengthened relationships with merchants he had dealt with before. Most valuable, perhaps, was the education, exposure to civilizations that challenged his assumptions about the world. As the caravan departed Baghdad, Ahmad looked back at the round walls receding in the distance. The younger men and his crew were similarly awed, their worldview permanently expanded. Thorvald, the young crew member who had questioned the unglamorous reality of trade during the portage, now understood that commerce was about more than moving goods. It was about connecting cultures, bridging vast distances, transforming exotic goods into familiar luxuries, and vice versa. The Vikings might be famous as raiders, but their role as merchants was equally important, perhaps more so in the long term. The return journey proceeded more quickly than the southern trip. The routes now familiar, relationships with local rulers established, the current flowing in favorable directions proportions of the river travel, but the challenges remain substantial. Portages still require backbreaking labor. Tolls still consume profit margins. Weather and accidents still threatened. At one point, illness struck several crew members, a fever that killed one man and others weakened. They buried him in foreign soil, far from ancestors and homeland, the price some paid for these ambitious journeys. Weeks later, approaching Novgorod, Attar reflected on what this trading network meant in larger terms. The connections between Scandinavia and the Islamic world were transforming both regions. Silver flowing north was enriching Norse societies, funding the development of towns and markets, enabling the emergence of kingdoms from what had been scattered chieftaincies. Ideas flowed along with goods. Exposure to more sophisticated civilizations was gradually changing Norse culture, making some question traditional practices, encouraging some to convert to Christianity or even Islam, inspiring improvements in shipbuilding, metalworking, and other technologies. In the opposite direction, northern goods were reaching markets across the Islamic world and beyond. The furs and amber that seemed common in Scandinavia became luxury items in Baghdad and beyond. The slaves, the morally troubling field labor needs in the caliphate's economy. More subtly, Norse merchants were becoming cultural ambassadors, their presence in eastern cities creating awareness of distant northern lands, encouraging the geographic and ethnographic studies that scholars like Aidan Fadal would undertake. The expedition reached their Norwegian fjord in early autumn, the familiar landscape welcoming after months abroad. The community gathered to greet them, eager for news and to see Oddigsodal returned. Attar distributed the wealth. Crew members received their shares according to their roles and seniority. Families of the lost crew member were compensated, and offerings were made to the gods in thanks for survival. The silk and spices would be distributed through local networks, sold to wealthy individuals who value exotic luxuries, or saved for tribute payments and diplomatic gifts. Attar's own family welcomed him home, his wife and children grown familiar with his long absences, but always anxious until his return. He gifted his wife silk fabric of extraordinary quality, a color of blue impossible to achieve with northern dyes, and jewelry purchased in Baghdad featuring pearls and stones unknown in Scandinavia. For his sons he brought fine knives with Damascus steel, both practical tools and symbols of exotic travel. For his community he brought stories, descriptions of cities and peoples, of customs and beliefs, of the vast world beyond their fjord. That winter, Attar defeats and gatherings recounted his journey. He spoke of the cruel and portages between rivers, the diplomatic negotiations with local rulers, the markets of the Volga-Bulgars, and the overwhelming magnificence of Baghdad. He described the House of Wisdom where scholars pursued knowledge, the markets offering goods from 3 continents, the architectural wonders that made Norse buildings seem primitive. Some listeners doubted his descriptives. How could cities be so large, buildings so grand, markets so diverse? But those who had traveled with him confirmed the accounts, and slowly the community's understanding of the world expanded. Young men listened with particular intensity, some seeing only the potential for adventure and wealth, others beginning to understand that the world was far larger and more complex than their isolated fjord might suggest. For Walt, the trio parapized from ability to meet to player, transformed from Nayadu to experienced trader, would lead his own his building autos, relationships, and knowledge. The transmission of commercial expertise across generations was creating a merchant class in for society, complementing and sometimes replacing the traditional warrior elite. The trade networks auto participated in what transforming European history in ways that wouldn't be fully apparent for centuries. The Norse merchant settlers across eastern rivers, Latigo, Novgorod, later Kia, would evolve into the foundation of Russian civilization, a blending of Scandinavia and Slavic cultures. The wealth flowing from eastern trade would help fund the Viking Age expansions into Britain, Ireland, and eventually Iceland and Greenland. The cultural exposure to Byzantine and Islamic civilizations would contribute to Christianity's eventual spread throughout Scandinavia's. Most fundamentally, these networks demonstrated the Vikings were more than raiders. They were explorers and merchants, diplomats and cultural intermediaries, connecting regions that otherwise had little contact. The image of Vikings as simply violent warriors plundering defenseless Munafat, while based in some historical reality, obscured the more complex trip that most peoples were active participants in the broader commercial and cultural exchanges of the Livona area. Franz Hoyt's may not have years to Baghdad's splendor. These modern notices traced out the Sayyidads, ideas, peoples, and ultimately helped shape the development of the European and Russian civilization. The networks they established maintained her gruesome physical labor as sophisticated diplomatic tales represented a higher achievement as significant in the
Chapter 4. Trans-Saharan Gold.
wealth beneath killing sands.
The first time young Omar ibn Hassan laid eyes upon Timbuktu, he understood why men spoke of the city in hushed, reverent tones around campfires from the Mediterranean coast to the Atlantic shores. The year was 1338, merely a decade after the legendary Mansa Musa had returned from his Hajj to Mecca, a pilgrimage so lavish with gold that it had disrupted Cairo's economy for 12 years and announced to the Islamic world and beyond that West Africa possessed wealth beyond imagination. Omar stood at the edge of the Niger River bend, watching the morning sun paint the city's earthen structures in shades of amber and copper. The Sankore Mosque rose above the tightly packed compounds, its distinctive pyramidal minaret reaching toward Allah as if attempting to bridge heaven and earth. Hundreds of buildings constructed from banko, a mixture of mud, straw, and palm oil that hardened under the relentless sun, created an urban landscape that seemed to grow organically from the Sahel itself. The air vibrated with activity, merchants shouting prices in Songhai, Arabic, Tamashek, and Mandinka, scholars debating fine points of Islamic jurisprudence in the shade of the mosque's walls, caravans of camels groaning under loads of salt slabs, their bells creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the human voices. Omar's father, Hassan ibn Muhammad, placed a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. That hand bore the scars of 40 years crossing the Sahara, burns from rope and sun, calluses from guiding recalcitrant camels, a missing fingertip lost to frostbite during a winter crossing when desert nights dropped below freezing. "Remember this moment," Hassan said, his voice roughened by decades of sand and wind. "You are witnessing the junction point where three worlds meet, the gold kingdoms of the south, the salt deserts of the Sahara, and the merchant empires of the Maghreb and beyond. Everything you see, the scholars, the books, the mosques, the wealth, all of it flows from what moves across the sand. And our family, for 12 generations, has been the blood that keeps this trade alive." Omar nodded, trying to absorb the magnitude of what his father described. He was 17 years old, embarking on his third trans-Saharan crossing, and this would be the first where he would help lead rather than simply follow. The Berber tribe to which his family belonged, the Masufa, had dominated the Central Saharan routes for centuries. They were the hereditary guides, the keepers of knowledge that meant the difference between reaching the next well with water to spare and dying with swollen tongues amid the dunes. This knowledge was not written in books, though Omar could read Arabic, Tifinagh, and even some Latin learned from captured texts. Instead, it lived in the body's memory, the way certain rock formations appeared at dawn, the taste of sand that indicated proximity to underground water, the behavior of wind patterns that preceded deadly storms, the stars' positions across seasons, the nearly invisible tracks that marked routes used since before the Prophet's time. The caravan they would join was assembling at the city's northern edge, where the buildings gave way to scrub vegetation, and then eventually to nothing but sand and stone and heat. Omar and his father walked through Timbuktu's labyrinthine streets, passing the famous Sankore Madrasa, where students from across the Islamic world studied under renowned scholars. Through an open doorway, Omar glimpsed rows of young men bent over manuscripts, copying texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law. Timbuktu possessed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, making it one of the Islamic world's great intellectual centers. The books themselves were valuable trade goods, commissioned by wealthy merchants and scholars from as far away as Cairo and Baghdad. "The Malians understand something the Europeans do not yet grasp," Hassan observed, following his son's gaze. "Gold buys many things, but knowledge purchases the future. Mansa Musa brought back architects, scholars, and poets from his Hajj. He paid them in gold, yes, but what they built here will outlast any empire." They continued toward the merchant's quarter, where the true business of Timbuktu unfolded. Here, gold dust was weighed on delicate scales, tested by experts who could detect impurities by color and texture alone. The gold came from regions to the south and southwest, Bambouk, Boré, and Akan, where rivers carried flakes of the precious metal eroded from ancient rock formations. West African gold was renowned for its purity, and during the Middle Ages it supplied more than half of the Old World supply. Without it, European kingdoms could not mint adequate coinage, Mediterranean trade would contract, and the Islamic world's economic dynamism would falter. The price of gold in any given year could determine whether kingdoms rose or fell, whether armies marched or stayed home, whether merchant houses prospered or collapsed. And all of it had to cross the Sahara, carried on camels guided by men like Hassan and Omar. In the gold market, merchants from a dozen cultures negotiated in a polyglot mixture of languages. Omar recognized Jula traders from the forest kingdoms to the south. Their robes dyed with indigo that left their skin faintly blue, known across West Africa as commercial specialists whose trading networks extended for thousands of miles. Wangara traders, the term that referred to various Mande-speaking groups who controlled gold production, kept the actual mine location secret, a commercial strategy that had persisted for centuries. Arab traders from Fez, Cairo, and Tripoli examined goods with practiced eyes, calculating values across the multiple currencies and barter systems that intersected here. A group of Tuareg nobles
distinctive in their indigo face veils that left only their eyes visible, negotiated for horses, prized military assets in West Africa, where the tsetse fly made breeding difficult. Behind them, a Venetian merchant, one of the few Europeans who had made this journey, attempted to purchase gold directly, his Arabic broken but his mathematics precise. "Watch how they weigh the gold," Hassan instructed quietly, indicating a jeweler trader finalizing a transaction. "See how the weights are checked and counterchecked. Trust exists in this market, but verification is sacred. A reputation destroyed about cheating might take 3 generations to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. Commercial relationships here span lifetimes. That merchant's grandfather traded with my grandfather. When we cross the desert together, our lives depend on each other. No amount of gold is worth destroying that bond." The transaction completed with ritual phrases in Arabic, invoking Allah's blessing on fair dealing. The jeweler trader carefully packed his purchased goods, copper purse from the north, glass beads from Venice, cowrie shells that serve as currency in regions to the south, while his counterpart measured out gold dust into leather pouches marked with his seal. Omar noticed armed guards standing at discreet distances, watchful but not intrusive. Timbuktu's commercial success depended on security. Mali's emperor maintained order through a combination of military presence and legal systems that severely punished theft. Even Batuta, the famous Moroccan traveler who had visited 8 years before Omar's arrival, wrote admiringly of Mali's security, noting that travelers could carry goods worth fortunes without fear of robbery. They moved deeper into the market, where salt occupied an entire district. Here was the other half of the equation that made the trans-Saharan trade viable: complementary scarcity. Salt, essential for human survival in the tropical heat, for preserving meat and fish, for livestock health, and for various medicinal purposes, was desperately scarce in West Africa's forested regions. Meanwhile, the Sahara contained vast salt deposits, ancient sea beds from when the desert had been ocean, now exposed by millennia of evaporation. The most famous mines lay at Tahaza, 2 weeks' hard travel north into the desert's heart, where enslaved imple and desperately poor freeloaders extracted massive slabs of salt under conditions that killed many within years. Each slab weighed about 40 kilograms, cut from solid salt deposits and shaped for transport. In Timbuktu, these slabs commanded high prices. Further south, in the gold-raising regions, that price quadrupled or more. In the forest kingdoms near the coast, salt's value approached that of gold itself, sometimes achieving the legendary weight-for-weight exchange that seemed absurd to those who did not understand the economics of biological necessity versus temperative luxury. Omar helped his father inspect the salt slabs they were transported south on their return. Hassan taught him to identify quality. Pure white salt commanded premium prices, while gray or pink varieties, though perfectly functional, sold for less. They checked the cracks that might indicate a slab would break during transport, and verified weights, as some unscrupulous sellers added moisture to increase mass. "We carry salt, Sal," Hassan explained. The Omarite heard this hundreds of times, but those are merely the primary goods. Watch White House moves. He gestured around the market. Cola nuts from the forest, stimulants that Muslims use since we cannot drink alcohol. Ivory from elephants, destined for workshops in Cairo and Venice. Leather goods from House of Craftsmen, the finest in the world. Enslaved people, sadly captured in wars or raids, bound for agricultural estates in North Africa or domestic service throughout the Islamic world. Moving south, horses that transform military power. Copper for artistic and practical purposes. Dates and figs that will not grow in tropical climates. Cloth manufactured in North Africa and Europe. Paper and books, weapons, glass goods, ceramics. Every item crosses the desert and tremendous risk and cost, which means every item must be valuable enough to justify that risk. The economic principle was elegant in its simplicity. Only goods with high value-to-weight ratios can profitably cross the Sahara. Bulk commodities, grain, timber, or dairy pottery were economically impossible to transport across 2,000 kilometers of waterless waste, but gold, salt, ivory, enslaved people, fine textiles, and luxury goods generated sufficient profit margins to justify the journey. This natural selection of commerce meant that Saharan trade concentrated wealth rather than distributing it, enriching relatively small numbers of merchants, traders in the kingdoms that taxed them, while ordinary people saw little direct benefit. Yet the indirect effects rippled across societies: military power funded by customs duties, architectural projects employing thousands, scholarly institutions attracting intellectuals, and craft specialists creating goods for wealthy patrons. Over the following days, Omar participated in caravan preparation, a process as ritualized as any religious ceremony because survival depended on getting every detail correct. Their caravan would consist of approximately 300 camels, carrying mixed goods northward. 50 men would make the journey: merchants, drivers, guards, and guides. Hassan would lead along with 2 other experienced Masufa guides who knew alternate routes if wells fail or political conditions made the standard path dangerous. The camels were the irreplaceable foundation of Saharan trade. Dromedaries, single-hump camels, had evolved for desert conditions over millions of years and have been domesticated by humans for thousands. No other animal could survive the Sahara's conditions while carrying heavy loads. Horses, donkeys, and oxen would die whole days. Camels could travel 7 to 10 days without water, surviving on moisture from sparse vegetation, and their bodies could tolerate losing up to 40% of body weight through dehydration and then rehydrate rapidly without physiological damage that would kill other mammals. Broad and soft, distributed weight efficiently over sand. Their nostrils could close against blowing sand. Their long eyelashes and ear lashes prevented sand infiltration, and their mouths could consume thorny desert vegetation that would shred the mouths of other herbivores. But camels were also stubborn, ill-tempered creatures, prone to biting and spitting. Loading them required skill and timing, done early in the morning when they released fractious. Each animal would carry approximately 150 kilograms, less than their maximum capacity, but desert crossing required reserves and strength. The loads were balanced precisely, distributed in leather bags and woven baskets secured with complex rope systems that prevented shifting during travel. Watch master drivers work, their movements economic and confident, speaking to the camels in tones that somehow communicated authority without aggression. A camel is not a friend, his father warned, not for the first time. It is a tool, but a tool with will. Respected, maintain it, never trusted completely. I have seen men killed by camels, kicked, bitten, crushed. The animal that carries you faithfully for 50 days may turn on you on the 51st if you grow careless. The goods being loaded represent a year's profit for many of the merchants. Omar learned to calculate the economics. Gold purchased in Timbuktu might cost a certain price in cowrie shells or other trade goods. That same gold delivered to Sigil Mesa on the desert's northern edge would sell for 2 to 3 times the purchase price if the journey succeeded. But factoring the costs, purchasing and maintaining camels, hiring cars and drivers, paying the guides, providing food and water for the human participants, gifts and bribes for political authorities along the route, and the unpredictable losses from death, theft, or accident, who can consider that perhaps one journey entailed catastrophic losses, an entire caravan killed by drought, sandstorm, or raiders. The mathematics produced profits, but hardly the fantastic margins that outsiders imagined. The truly wealthy traders were those who survived decades of crossings, who built networks of relationships, who invested profits into multiple caravans, thus spreading risk, and who vertically integrated their operations by owning soul mines, gold trading contacts, camel herds, and real estate in multiple cities. The evening before departure, Hassan took Omar to visit an old merchant named Yusuf ibn Yassibin, who had made the crossing 63 times over 40 years. Yusuf had grown wealthy enough to retire, but continued trading, he claimed, because the alternative was boredom. His compound occupied a substantial section of Timbuktu's merchant quarter, multiple buildings arranged around courtyards where wives, children, servants, and business associates lived in a small community dedicated to commerce. Yusuf himself, thin as a desert acacia and eagerly as weathered, received him in a room lined with cushions and carpets. Tea was served in the Saharan style, green tea with mint and sugar, poured from height to great foam, consumed in 3 glasses whose taste progressed from bitter to balance it to sweet. Your son has the...
On the 8th day north of Erawan, they reached Ta'awdeni, the salt mining complex that existed in defiance of all logic. Here, approximately 700 kilometers into absolute desert, with the nearest agriculture over a week's journey away, several hundred people labored in perhaps the most unforgiving workplace on Earth. Ta'awdeni owed its existence to massive salt deposits, ancient seabeds that lay beneath the surface. The salt was pure, white, and easily split into slabs perfect for transport. These qualities, combined with insatiable southern demand, made the operation economically viable despite conditions that killed workers regularly. The mines themselves were open pits, where workers, many enslaved, others desperately poor free men with no alternatives, excavated the salt using picks and wedges. The salt formed crystalline layers that could be split along natural plains, producing slabs approximately 1 meter long, 40 centimeters wide, and 5 centimeters thick. These slabs, each weighing about 40 kilograms, were the standard unit of salt trade. They would be transported south to Timbuktu, where their value had roughly doubled, then further south to the gold-producing regions, where their value doubled again, and potentially to the forest kingdoms near the coast, where they became literally worth their weight in gold. Working conditions were apocalyptic. Summer temperatures in the pits exceeded 60 degrees Celsius. No shade existed. Water, brought in by dedicated caravans, was expensive. Food was even more expensive, as nothing grew within weeks of travel. Workers lived in structures made from salt blocks, sleeping on salt, breathing air saturated with salt particles that dried and cracked skin, damaged lungs, and stung eyes. Life expectancy for enslaved workers was measured in years. Even free workers seldom lasted a decade. Yet the operation continued because the profit margin justified the human cost, a calculation that Omar found troubling, but which Hassan accepted with fatalistic pragmatism. "This is the world we inhabit," Hassan said quietly, as they watched workers loading salt slabs onto their camels. "I did not create these conditions. I cannot change them. I can only navigate the reality that exists. Yes, enslaved people suffer here terribly. They also suffer on plantations in North Africa, as domestic servants throughout the Islamic world, and in countless other situations. The moral weight of slavery is borne by those who enslave, not by those who transport trade goods. Or so I tell myself to sleep at night." Omar wanted to argue, but found no solid ground for disagreement. The same gold that funded Timbuktu scholars and mosques was extracted by labor that was often unfree. The same commercial networks that brought books and knowledge also brought enslaved people and suffering. Commerce was amoral, responding to supply and demand, profit and loss, without inherent ethical direction. The ethics came from participants' choices, laws created by kingdoms and empires, and religious teachings that might counsel mercy but rarely prevented cruelty when profit was at stake. They left Ta'awdeni with their camels loaded with salt, the caravan's purpose now fully realized. They carried southern gold northward and northern salt southward, the fundamental exchange that made the trans-Saharan trade viable. But they also carried information, news of kingdoms, prices in distant markets, political developments, religious teachings, and cultural innovations. In an age before telecommunications, when information traveled only as fast as humans could carry it, merchants served as crucial nodes in communication networks that spanned continents. The next major waypoint was Tagaza, once the Sahara's primary salt source, but now declining as Ta'awdeni's deposits proved easier to exploit. Tagaza was a haunted place, abandoned structures built entirely from salt blocks, slowly dissolving in the rare rains, monuments to the impermanence of even the most profitable enterprises. A small population remained, extracting salt for local markets, but the great caravans increasingly bypassed the settlement. Hassan insisted on stopping, partly for water, but primarily for education. "Look carefully," he told Omar.
20 years ago, Tagaza was what Tao Deni is now, vital, wealthy, horrible. But deposits were exhausted or became harder to reach. Merchants shifted to Tao Deni. In another 20 years, Tao Deni may be abandoned too, and salt will come from somewhere else. Nothing in the desert is permanent. Wells fail, routes become dangerous, kingdoms fall, new paths open. Adaptability determines survival. The Daids who insist on using only the routes their fathers used become lost when conditions change. The merchants who cannot adjust to new political realities lose their goods to confiscation. Rigidity is death. Remember this. They pressed northward, deeper into the Sahara's heart. The landscape became almost hallucinatory in its emptiness, sand in every direction, broken occasionally by rock formations that emerged like islands in a beige sea. The rocks themselves were sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes, monuments to erosion standing where mountains once existed. Sometimes they passed skeletons, camels, occasionally humans, marking points where earlier travelers had failed. Hassan insisted on stopping at one such site, a small field of bones that had been human and camel together. 14 years ago, Hassan said quietly, a caravan of 80 camels, 20 men. They missed the well at Bir al-Kasha by 5 kilometers, navigation error, probably during a sandstorm. By the time they realized the mistake, they lacked the water reserves to search. They tried to push forward to the next well, gambling they could make the distance. They lost the gamble. We found them 4 weeks later, buried the human remains according to Islamic law, left the camels for scavengers, but in the deep desert, even scavengers are scarce, so the bones remain. It was a sobering reminder of the stakes involved. The desert forgave nothing. A small mistake, miscalculating distance, misreading terrain features, misjudging water reserves, could cascade into catastrophe. Hassan's expertise and the traditional knowledge of the Masufa guides represented the accumulated experience of centuries, purchased with the lives of those who had made fatal errors. On the 17th day from Tao Deni, Hassan's expertise was tested severely. They arrived at a well called Inazawa, a reliable water source that the guides had used for decades. The well consisted of a deep hole dug to the water table, reinforced with rocks to prevent collapse, with a rope and leather bucket system for drawing water. But when they dropped the bucket, it returned empty. They tried again, nothing. Hassan ascended partway into the well, examining the situation by torchlight. When he emerged, his face was grim. The water table has dropped, he announced to the assembled guides and senior merchants. Whether due to drought or geological changes, I cannot say, but there is no water here. Silence greeted this news. Inazawa was crucial to the planned route. Without it, they faced difficult choices. The next well on the standard route was 5 days ahead, further than they could reach with current water supplies, especially for the camels. An alternate well existed 3 days to the east, but that deviated from the safest path and entered territory where raiders were more common. Or they could return south to the previous well, refill completely, and attempt a longer push to bypass Inazawa entirely, but this added a week to the journey and consumed supplies. The senior merchants argued for the eastern route, prioritizing speed. The guards preferred returning south, preferring the extra week over increased risk of banditry. Hassan and the other guides conferred quietly, calculating distances, assessing the caravan's condition, evaluating risks. Omar watched Isfazar work through the problem, seeing the weight of leadership that came with expertise. If Hassan chose wrong, people would die, and his family's reputation, built over 12 generations, could be destroyed. We go east, Hassan decided finally. The caravan is strong, we have not yet suffered significant losses, and the camels are in good condition. The raider risk is real, but manageable if we maintain vigilance. The alternative routes carry other risks that I judge worse. We depart in 4 hours, using the coolest part of night to make distance before heat peaks Tuora. The decision made the caravan adapted. Water was rationed even more strictly, guards were doubled. The pace increased slightly, pushing both camels and humans harder. For the next 3 days, tension rode with them like an extra traveler. Every rock formation could hide raiders. Every sound might signal attack. The guards, professional fighters hired specifically for caravan protection, kept weapons ready and high scanning. Omar learned that danger sharpened awareness. Time seemed to slow, and details became vivid in ways they never were during routine travel. The alternate well, when they reached it, proved functional. Not abundant. The water was brackish and required saddling before consumption, but sufficient. They spent a full day there, letting the camels drink deeply and refilling every container. Hassan's gamble had conceded, but Omar noticed how the successful outcome did not erase the stress from his father's face. Leadership, he realized, meant living with consequences whether outcomes were good or bad, knowing that success required repeated correct decisions while a single failure could be catastrophic. They entered the Tanaz Rift, one of the Sahara's most desolate regions, sometimes called the Land of Terror. Here, even by desert standards, conditions were extreme. No wells existed for over 500 kilometers, no vegetation, no landmarks except occasional rock outcrops, just sand, stone, heat, and emptiness. Crossing the Tanaz Rift required carrying all water for the entire section, which meant heavier loads and slower pace at precisely the moment when speed would have been advantageous. It also required navigation based almost entirely on celestial observation and dead reckoning, as terrain features were insufficient for reliable orientation. Hassan taught Omar the art of sand reading. Different types of sand dunes, percans, longitudinals, formed in response to wind patterns and indicated direction. The texture and composition of sand varied by region. An experienced guide could identify location based on sand alone, even the sound of wind change based on terrain, though this was knowledge that came only through decades of experience. On the 4th day in the Tanaz Rift, they encountered a sandstorm. It began with an eerie calm, the wind dying completely, the air becoming oppressively still. Then the horizon to the north turned brown, a wall of suspended sand that advanced toward them like a solid thing. "Prepare for storm," Hassan shouted. "Ground the camels, cover everything, survival positions." The practice caravan members moved quickly. Camels were forced to lie down and positioned with backs to the approaching storm. Loads were secured with extra ropes and covered with leather sheets. Humans wrapped their tajulmust, the long cloth head wraps worn throughout the Sahara, around their faces, leaving only narrow slits for eyes. They clustered in small groups using camels as windbreaks and waited. The storm hit like a physical blow. Wind screamed across the desert, carrying sand that acted like liquid, flowing around obstacles, penetrating any opening, stripping skin and shredding cloth. Visibility dropped at 0. Breathing required careful timing to avoid inhaling sand. The noise was overwhelming, wind howling, sand hissing against leather and cloth, camels groaning in distress, and underneath it all, a deep roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Omar huddled against his camel, eyes squeezed shut, cloth wrapped tightly around his face. He tried to breathe slowly through fabric layers that filtered out most sand but also made each breath an effort. Time lost meaning. The storm might have lasted an hour or 10 hours. He had no way to measure except the growing ache in muzzles locked in protective positions. At some point he realized that noise had diminished. The wind still blew, but without the killing force of the storm's peak. He cautiously unwrapped enough cloth to peer out. The world was transformed. Sand had drifted around and over everything. Camels appeared as vague mounds. Equipment was buried. The landscape had been completely rearranged. Dunes that had existed before were gone. New formations had appeared, and the caravan's carefully marked path had vanished beneath fresh sand. Hassan emerged from his shelter, sand pouring off him as he stood. His first action was counting camels, counting men, verifying that the caravan remained intact. 2 camels were dead, suffocated when sand filled their nostrils faster than they could expel it. 3 men required treatment for sand-abraded eyes, but the caravan had survived relatively intact, a testament to Hassan's quick recognition of approaching danger and the members' practiced response. The next task was re-establishing their route. Every landmark had changed. Hassan and the other guys conferred, using the sun's position and their memory of distance travel before the storm to estimate their location. Then they examined the new dune patterns, reading them like text to determine current wind direction, and by extension, approximate orientation. But finally, they made an edgy guess about the cross-route expedition and field travel. Omar understood that this was not precise navigation, but rather informed approximation, a best guess supported by experience. In the featureless Tenerife, it was the only option available. They emerged from the Tenerife 10 days after entering it, arriving at a well called Arak. The relief was palpable. They had crossed the desert's worst section and survived. From here, terrain gradually improved. Wells became more frequent, vegetation began to reappear, and the northern edge of the Sahara approached. But they were not yet safe. The final sections brought different news, human rather than environmental. As they approached Sigillasa, the great trading city on the desert's northern edge, they entered territories controlled by various kingdoms, sultanates, and tribal confederations, each of which sought to tax, control, or profit from trans-Saharan trade. The caravan encountered its first checkpoint 2 days from Sigillasa. A military post manned by soldiers from the Marinid Sultanate, which currently controlled much Morocco, stopped them to verify documentation and collect taxes. The commander, a scarred veteran who looked like he had fought in every border conflict of the past 20 years, examined Hassan's papers, elaborate documents written in Arabic, sealed with multiple seals, attesting to the caravan's legitimate commercial nature and listing with significant understatement of the goods being transported. Gold? The commander asked directly. Some, Hassan acknowledged carefully. We have primarily carrying salt. This was true in terms of volume, but deeply false regarding value. The gold, packed in discreet leather bags, represented far more wealth than the salt. The commander knew this, Hassan knew he knew this, and both understood and were engaging in a ritual whose outcome was predetermined. The Sultan's tax on gold is 1/10, the commander stated. Salt is 1/20. I will inspect the cargo to verify compliance. This was the moment when Hassan's diplomatic express made it much in staff expertise.
Chapter 5. The Spice Routes, Islands of Fragrant Fortune.
The air itself was a currency. Ahmad al-Rashid understood this truth as he stood at the prow of his family's trading vessel, the Bintang Timur, the Eastern Star, watching the volcanic peaks of the Banda Islands emerge from the morning mist like gods rising from the sea. The breeze that filled the ship's woven sails carried something more valuable than the wind itself, the unmistakable perfume of nutmeg, that aromatic treasure that had justified his family's voyages across treacherous waters for 7 generations. The scent was so powerful here, just miles from shore, that it seemed to transform the very air into something you could weigh, measure, and sell. In the markets of Cairo, a single pound of these fragrant seeds could purchase a modest house. In London or Paris, that same pound might buy 3 houses or a small estate. The Europeans called nutmeg and its sister spice mace brown gold, but that comparison failed to capture their true value. Gold was merely rare. These spices were miraculous, found nowhere else on Earth except these tiny specks of volcanic land in the vast Indonesian archipelago. Ahmad was 43 years old, his face weathered by decades of salt spray and tropical sun, his eyes still sharp enough to read the subtle shifts and wave patterns that warned of hidden reefs or approaching storms. He had first made this journey at age 7, clinging to his father's robes as the Bintang Timur navigated the treacherous passages between islands, learning the secrets that separated master navigators from those whose bones decorated the ocean floor. The knowledge was not written in books. It lived in the body, in the practiced eye, in the instinct developed over thousands of voyages. His father had learned from his grandfather, who had learned from his great-grandfather, an unbroken chain of maritime wisdom extending back to times before memory. The Banda Islands numbered 10 in total, though only a few were inhabited, their combined land area so small that you could walk across the largest in an afternoon. Yet these insignificant patches of volcanic soil were among the most strategically important places on Earth, the exclusive source of nutmeg and mace, spices that had launched ships, enriched empires, and would soon draw the attention of European powers whose arrival would fundamentally transform not just these islands, but the entire global order. For now, in this moment in the early 15th century, the trade remained in the hands of those who had conducted it for centuries, the Javanese, Malay, and Arab merchants whose understanding of monsoon patterns and maritime routes had created the first truly global trading network.
Ahmad studied the approaching shoreline with practiced assessment. The Banda Islands were unlike the lush, heavily forested islands further west. Here, the volcanic soil and tropical climate created perfect conditions for the nutmeg tree, a species found nowhere else in the world. The trees themselves were modest in appearance, growing perhaps 40 feet tall, with dense foliage that provided shade for the precious fruits. The nutmeg apple resembled a small peach, yellow or red when ripe, but it was what lay inside that commanded such astronomical prices. Crack open that avar flesh and you found the seed covered in a lacy crimson coating, the mace, which itself was a separate spice. Remove that delicate web and you reach the hard shell containing the nutmeg kernel itself. Each tree produces perhaps 2,000 fruits per year, and the labor required to harvest, process, and prepare these seeds for market was intensive, skilled work that the Bandanese had perfected over centuries. The eastern star approached the main island, Nyera, where the largest settlement had grown over generations of spice wealth. The harbor was modest compared to the great ports that lay ahead on Ahmad's route, Malacca, Calicut, Aden, but it bustled with purposeful activity. Dozens of vessels crowded the anchorage, swift Malay prahus with their distinctive outriggers, sturdy Javanese junk ships with multiple masts, even a few Chinese junks whose presence had become rarer since the great treasure fleets had ceased their voyages decades earlier. The political situation had grown more complex in recent years. The Bandanese themselves, divided among several small sultanates and village communities, controlled the production but had always relied on outsiders for transport and distribution. Javanese merchants like Ahmad's family had long dominated this trade, but increasingly Malay traders from the powerful Sultanate of Malacca sought to control the flow of spices through their strategic port. Behind them, always present though not yet dominant, were the Tamil and Gujarati merchants of India, and the Arab traders whose networks extended to the Red Sea and beyond. Everyone understood that the real profits came not from growing or even transporting the spices, but from controlling the numerous exchanges between source and final market. A pound of nutmeg that sold for 1 gold coin in Banda would fetch 5 in Malacca, 10 in Calicut, 20 in Aden, and 50 or more in Venice. Each intermediary added costs, transportation, storage, risk, and of course profit, but the markup far exceeded any reasonable accounting of expenses. The system persisted because no single merchant, no matter how wealthy or ambitious, could control the entire chain from these remote islands to the markets of Europe. As the crew prepared to anchor, Ahmad reflected on the changes he had witnessed over his lifetime. His grandfather had spoken of times when the spice trade was more evenly distributed, when numerous small operators competed on relatively equal terms, when the Bandanese themselves could negotiate favorable prices because multiple buyers competed for their harvest. Those days were passing. Now larger merchant houses with significant capital were consolidating control, able to purchase entire harvests in advance, to maintain ships and warehouses, to establish permanent representatives in distant ports. The shift concerned Ahmad not merely for commercial reasons, but because he sensed a fundamental transformation in the nature of the trade. Where once there had been relationships built over generations, mutual dependencies and respect, increasingly there was pure calculation, the reduction of people and places to mere sources of profit. And beyond all the Asian powers jockeying for advantage, there were disturbing reports of European interest in finding direct routes to the spice sources. The Portuguese, it was said, were attempting to sail around the entire continent of Africa, a voyage so ambitious it seemed almost mythical. If they succeeded, if European ships with their heavy cannon and aggressive commercial practices reached these islands, everything would change. The landing party included Ahmad's eldest son Khalid and 6 crewmen who would serve as porters and guards. The Bandanese community recognized Ahmad immediately. His family had been trading here for generations, and the welcome was warm but businesslike. Time was a factor. The eastern monsoon that had brought them here would soon reverse, and to miss that seasonal wind shift was to be stranded for months. The spice harvest was in full swing, and the scene that unfolded as Ahmad walked toward the main processing area was one he had witnessed countless times but never ceased to find remarkable. Women and children primarily performed the delicate work of harvesting and processing. Nutmeg cultivation was not farming in the conventional sense. The trees grew in what appeared to be natural forest, though in fact the Bandanese had carefully managed these crops for centuries, selectively encouraging productive varieties, clearing competing vegetation, and developing sophisticated understanding of what modern science would later call horticulture. When the yellow-red fruits ripened, harvesting required careful timing. Too early and the spices lacked full flavor, too late and they would fall and potentially spoil. The harvesters used long poles with hooks to pull down high branches, carefully placing the fruits in woven baskets. At the processing stations, the outer flesh was removed, used locally as a preserve or simply composted. The delicate lacy coating, the mace, was carefully peeled away and laid on palm leaf mats to dry in the sun. This was skilled work. Damaged mace fetched lower prices, and the best workers could remove the covering in a single intact piece. The hard inner shell is then cracked to reveal the nutmeg kernel itself, which would also be dried, a process taking several weeks to prevent spoilage during the long sea voyage ahead. The labor was time-intensive and skilled, yet the Bandanese received only a tiny fraction of the eventual selling price in distant markets, a disparity that Ahmad recognized as both unjust and seemingly immutable. The economics of distance and risk, the multiplication of intermediaries, the final buyer's willingness to pay almost any price, these factors created a value chain that enormously benefited middlemen like himself, while leaving producers with modest returns. Ahmad negotiated with several Bandanese sellers many had dealt with for decades, their conversations conducted in Malay, the lingua franca of maritime Southeast Asia. Prices were higher than last year, worded spread of increased European demand, but still reasonable by the standards of what these spices would fetch further west. He purchased nutmeg, mace, and also clothes, though the finest clothes came from islands further north, Ternate and Tidore in the Moluccas Monter. The clothes from Banda were good quality but not premium. Still, the European buyers could rarely tell the difference, and mixing grades was common practice. The transaction took 3 days, time for inspecting quality, agreeing on quantities, and conducting the elaborate social rituals that attended any significant trade in this culture. There were meals shared, stories exchanged, updates on family members and mutual acquaintances, careful inquiries about conditions in distant ports and the political situation in various kingdoms and sultanates. These conversations were not mere pleasantries. They constitute the intelligence gathering essential to successful long-distance trade. On the third evening, as Ahmad and his host shared roasted fish and rice under palm-thatched shelter, one of the Bandanese elders raised a concern that had clearly been on his mind. The Portuguese. Had Ahmad heard news of Portuguese ships? Yes, Ahmad acknowledged there were reports. Ships from that western kingdom had been probing down the African coast for years, each voyage reaching further south. Some said they sought a route around Africa to reach India and beyond. The elder nodded gravely. If they succeeded, if European ships reached these islands directly, what would become of the Bandanese? The traditional trading system, for all its iniquities, at least distributed benefits among many parties, but the Europeans, from what little was known of them, seemed to approach trade differently, not as an exchange between partners, however unequal, but as a form of conquest. Ahmad had no comforting answer. He shared the old man's concern, but felt powerless to effect events so large and distant. Individual merchants, even wealthy ones, were leaves blown by leaves they could not control. The global forces set in motion by European desire for spices, by the astronomical profits to be gained from direct access to sources, by the technologies of ocean navigation and ship-mounted cannon. These forces were gathering strength, and when they arrived, they would transform everything. But that disruption still lay years ahead, and for now, there was cargo to load and a route to sail. The Eastern Star departed Vonda on a morning of perfect clarity, her hold filled with spices carefully trapped in protective layers of leaves and cloth, then sealed in wooden chests to protect against moisture. The value of the cargo exceeded the value of the ship itself many times over, and the danger of piracy was real. The waters between the Indonesian islands were home to numerous groups who made their living by raiding merchant vessels. Some were organized and formidable, others were desperate fishermen who turned to piracy and hatches failed. Ahmad employed 6 armed guards in addition to his regular crew, men experienced in maritime combat, and the ship carried weapons sufficient to repel any but the most determined attack. The route from Banda to Malacca traced a path westward to the Indonesian archipelago, a journey adorned of 1,500 miles through waters that ranged from calm to treacherous. The passage required navigating narrow straits between highlands, avoiding reefs that could rip open a hull, and timing movements to catch favorable currents and avoid contrary winds. This is where the accumulated knowledge of generations proved its value. Ahmad and his senior crew knew these waters with an intimacy that no written chart could capture. They recognized islands by their distinctive profiles on their horizon, knew which passages were safe during which tidal conditions, remembered where fresh water could be obtained and which coastal communities were friendly versus hostile. They navigate by the night stars, using techniques developed over centuries of maritime experience. By day, the sun's position and the shadow cast by a simple vertical stick allowed accurate termination of latitude. By night, the stars provided guidance, with one particular triangle paid toward the sun across, another celestial marker. They had no instruments for determining longitude. That problem would not be solved for centuries, but experienced navigators developed instinctive sense of east west position from the compass accumulated depth, careful attention to speed and direction over time. They read the sea itself, the color of the water indicating depth for the presence of reefs, the patterns of waves suggesting nearby plains or approaching saltwater systems. Given the flights of birds provide cruise direction and distance is short. The journey from Malacca took 16 days, including stunts to set up over sports to pay out direct water and litter, intelligence about confessed support heads. Non-stop, they learned of pirates operating near sun district and adjusted their routes accordingly. At another year, grew news of political tensions in the Sultanate of Malacca, with factions competing for the reigning sultan's favor. Such information was vital. A merchant who had an important political actions, he might find himself to seek to order spacious at an iron far, or new Paris and post rider to blue. The final approach to Malacca was through the Strait to pose a sail, a narrow passage between Sumatra and the light and unfolded infinite metro traffic between land, the ocean, South China Sea. This geographical advantage had made Malacca incredibly means extremely crucial. Every ship traveled from China, Spice Island, India, Arabia, and eventually Europe passed through these waters, and the Sultanate extracted coal, provided warehouses, training facility, and maintained the stability necessary for commerce with Flash. Malacca in the early 15th century was perhaps the most cosmopolitan place on earth, and the sight, the great red market, and their two roadsteads never failed to impress despite its dozens of previous visits. Hundreds of vessels crafted the average, ships from every corner of the maritime world. Massive Chinese junks with their distinctive added sails allowed this dream pass, some measuring up to 300 feet high and holding hundreds of tons of cargo. Air tracks with bravely walking land, but perfected by centuries of the ocean trade, and new vessels with weary tires, floating party from the Malacca, gypsy packers, directing line trade sounds to be carried or had the straits to the earth. Ships routes about Southeast Asia, Javanese strung vessels like Ahmad, Holly Prahis, Simoni's yachts, Lebanese cargo, even some vessels from the Atlantic Persian Gulf and occasional ships to East Africa. The diversity of languages spoken in the Morocco Zaire. Malay served as the common language of trading and communication. As the
They understood that currents ran in relatively consistent patterns, that certain winds typically appeared at certain latitudes and seasons, that subtle signs, the color and temperature of the water, the types of seaweed observed, the species of birds spotted, even the shapes of clouds provided information to the trained observer. Modern scholars studying accounts of pre-modern Indian Ocean navigation often express amazement at the accuracy achieved without instruments that Europeans would consider essential. These Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian navigators crossed vast oceanic distances and consistently arrived at specific destinations using only the simplest tools. The kamal, essentially a small board with a knotted string that measured the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon to determine latitude, detailed mental maps of star positions throughout the year, careful observation and recording of speeds and directions. The system worked because of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, with each experienced navigator contributing refinements and observations to the collective understanding. The voyage also included very real dangers. Storms could arise with terrifying speed, especially during monsoon transition periods. When seas became violent, there was nothing to do but secure everything possible and endure. Ahmad had survived several severe storms and lost friends to others.
He knew which crew members stayed calm in emergencies, which panicked, which possessed the strength and skill to perform critical tasks when the ship was pitching wildly and waves washed over the deck. He knew how far he could push his vessel, when to run before the wind and when to attempt to heave to, when to lower sails entirely and hope the hull could withstand the battering. Piracy was another constant concern. The Indian Ocean hosted numerous groups who survived by raiding merchant vessels, and some operated with considerable sophistication: fast ships, good intelligence about merchant movements, sufficient numbers to overwhelm even well-defended targets. The most dangerous waters were near coasts and islands where pirates could operate from concealed bases, attacking from surprise and then melting away into geographical complexity that made pursuit futile. The standard defense was vigilance, armed guards, and when possible traveling in convoy with other merchant vessels. Pirates preferred easy targets. A ship that appeared capable of defending itself would usually be avoided in favor of more vulnerable prey. The Eastern Star sighted the Indian coast north of Calicut on a morning of spectacular beauty, the sun rising over the Western Ghats Mountains that ran parallel to the coast, the smell of land after weeks at sea, the distinctive profile of temples and fortifications that marked one of India's most important ports. Calicut was the capital of the Zamorin, a Hindu ruler who governed the Malabar coast and had built his kingdom's prosperity on encouraging trade. Unlike some regions where foreign merchants faced suspicion or restriction, Calicut welcomed traders from across the Indian Ocean, maintaining policies that made it a preferred destination. The harbor of Calicut was almost as diverse as Malacca, though the mix of vessels was different. Here, Indian ships predominated, the sturdy cargo vessels of the Malabar coast, specialized horse transports bringing Arabian steeds, fishing boats of various designs. Arab dhows were numerous, as Arab traders had been visiting and settling along this coast for centuries, establishing communities and intermarrying with local populations. Chinese vessels were rarer than in Malacca but not unknown, and increasingly, though still in small numbers, European ships were appearing, Portuguese vessels that had successfully navigated around Africa's Cape of Good Hope and were beginning to probe the Indian Ocean trade routes that had previously been the exclusive domain of Asian and Arab merchants. The arrival of Portuguese ships was viewed with mixed feelings by the established trading community. On one hand, they represented new buyers with seemingly inexhaustible demand for spices and willing to pay high prices. On the other hand, the Portuguese approached trade with practices that seemed alien and aggressive to those accustomed to the established norms of Indian Ocean commerce. They sought monopolies rather than accepting the competitive but relatively open market that had traditionally prevailed. They used military force to impose their commercial terms, their ships mounting cannon in numbers that dwarfed the armament of Asian vessels. They showed little respect for the complex web of relationships and mutual obligations that had made peaceful long-distance trade possible for centuries. Ahmad had encountered Portuguese merchants on a previous voyage to Calicut, and the experience had left him troubled. They were impressive in some ways. Their ships were sturdy, their navigation techniques included some innovations, their determination was undeniable, but they seemed to view trade as a form of warfare, every transaction a battle with winners and losers, rather than an exchange from both parties benefited. This mentality was difficult to comprehend for someone like Ahmad, whose family's success across generations rested precisely on building relationships based on mutual benefit and trust. If the Portuguese model prevailed, if trade became dominated by those with the most cannon rather than those offering the best terms, the entire system that had created Indian Ocean prosperity would be destroyed. The markets of Calicut offered even more variety than Malacca. This was not merely an entrepot where goods from east and west were exchanged, but also a production center and collection point for goods from India's vast interior. The pepper that was India's primary spice export was grown in the Western Ghats and brought to Calicut for sale. Indian textiles, among the most prized trade goods in the entire Indian Ocean economy, were produced in numerous inland centers and marketed through coastal ports like Calicut. Precious stones from Indian mines, indigo and other dyes, sugar, rice, and countless other products flow through these markets. And from the west came goods from Arabia, Persia, and Africa, frankincense and myrrh from the Arabian Peninsula, dates from the Gulf, Persian carpets and textiles, African ivory and gold. The visual variety was staggering. The spices and aromatic products, mounds of peppercorns, black and white, crystallized sugar in various grades, textiles in patterns and colors from subtle to brilliant, metals and metalwork, ceramics from multiple traditions, baskets and ropes and tools, livestock including Arabian horses valued by Indian nobility, weapons of every description. And everywhere, the business of negotiation and exchange conducted in the polyglot mix of languages that characterized international trade. Malay still common as many Southeast Asian merchants came here, Arabic spoken by the large Arab merchant community, Malayalam, the local language, Tamil spoken by merchants from further south, various North Indian languages, Persian among traders from further west, and increasingly Portuguese. The social organization of Calicut's trade was complex and sophisticated. Different merchant communities had designated quarters, sometimes called factories, where they maintained warehouses, living quarters, and small temples or mosques. The Zamorin's government provided security, adjudicated disputes through a system that combined local law with accommodation to foreign merchants' customs, and collected taxes that were substantial but predictable. The stability and fairness of this system were Calicut's greatest assets.
Merchants knew they would be treated equitably regardless of origin or religion, that contracts would be enforced, that their goods and persons would be protected. This reliability made Calicut prosperous, even though its natural harbor was not the finest and its location not the most strategic. Merchants valued predictability above almost all else. Ahmad sold the Southeast Asian goods he had brought from Malacca, the spices, aromatics, and exotic products that found good markets in India and further west. The prices were roughly double what he had paid in Malacca, though again costs had to be deducted. Port fees in Calicut were higher than Malacca, storage and handling charges accumulated, and he employed local agents who took commissions for facilitating introductions and negotiations. Still, the voyage from Java to Calicut had been profitable enough to cover all costs and leave surplus that Ahmad invested in goods for the next leg of his journey. He purchased pepper, India's primary export, in substantial quantities. The pepper trade was enormous. Europeans consumed pepper in quantities far exceeding all other spices combined, using it to preserve and flavor meat in the days before refrigeration, to disguise the taste of food beginning to spoil, and as a status symbol for those who could afford this expensive import. He also purchased Indian textiles, particularly the fine cotton cloth that was prized throughout the Indian Ocean world. European wool was too heavy for tropical climates, and silk was extremely expensive. Indian cotton provided the perfect middle option, light, durable, available in countless patterns. He bought indigo, the blue dye that was labor-intensive to produce but commanded high prices in distant markets, and he purchased smaller quantities of specialized goods, particular medicinal herbs valued in both Arab medicine and Southeast Asian traditions, semi-precious stones, fine metalwork. While in Calicut, Ahmad witnessed something that encapsulated both traditional systems' virtues and the threats it faced. A Portuguese merchant was attempting to negotiate for a cargo of pepper with one of the established Arab traders, and the interaction was not going well. The Portuguese, a young factor named Rodrigo, was insisting on prices that the Arab merchant Hassan found unreasonable. What made the exchange remarkable was not the disagreement over price, that was normal commerce, but the manner and underlying assumptions. Rodrigo approached the negotiation as a contest where one party would triumph and the other would lose. He showed no interest in Hassan's situation, the conditions that determined his prices, or the relationship that might develop through fair dealing. He simply wanted the lowest possible price and seemed willing to use any means to achieve it. Threats about Portuguese ships patrolling the coast, implications that those who did not offer favorable terms might face difficulties, suggestions that Portuguese cannon could enforce commercial terms if negotiation failed. Hassan, by contrast, approached trade in the traditional manner, as a process of finding terms acceptable to both parties, of establishing a relationship that might extend across years or even generations, of building reputation as someone who dealt fairly and therefore deserved to be dealt with fairly in return. The gulf between these approaches was profound, representing not just different negotiating styles, but fundamentally different understandings of what trade was and how it should be conducted. The encounter ended without a deal, and afterwards Ahmad spoke with Hassan, whom he had known for years. Hassan was deeply pessimistic about the future. If the Portuguese style of forced trade became dominant, if military power rather than reputation and relationships determined commercial success, if monopoly and extraction replaced the competitive but relatively open markets that had prevailed, then everything would change, and not for the better. Small merchants like themselves would be squeezed out, unable to compete with those who possessed ships and cannon. The Zamorin and other traditional rulers might resist for a time, but the technological and organizational advantages of European powers were significant. Hassan feared that within a generation, the entire Indian Ocean trading system would be transformed into something unrecognizable, and those who had prospered under the old system would find themselves marginalized or destroyed. Ahmad shared these fears, but felt powerless to affect outcomes determined by forces so much larger than individual merchants. What could one do except continue trading while it remains possible, prepare for changed conditions, perhaps move wealth into forms less vulnerable to disruption? These were questions without good answers. The Eastern Star's departure from Calicut was delayed by 2 weeks, longer than Ahmad had hoped, but not unusual. The cargo he planned to carry onward required assembly and preparation, business relationships needed maintenance, and he used the time to gather intelligence about conditions further west. He learned that political tensions in Yemen had increased, with competing factions fighting for control in ways that sometimes disrupted trade. He heard that the Portuguese were establishing a fortified post at Hormuz, the strategic highland controlling access to the Persian Gulf, which suggested their intentions to dominate rather than merely participate in Indian Ocean commerce. He received letters from his family in Java, his wife and younger children, his aging mother, brothers and cousins involved in various aspects of the family business, messages that had been carried by other merchants traveling routes in reverse. This correspondence network, informal but surprisingly reliable, connected the Indian Ocean world despite the absence of any organized postal service. The next leg of the journey from Calicut to the Arabian ports, particularly Aden at the entrance to the Red Sea, was another open ocean passage of some 1,200 miles, this time crossing the Arabian Sea. This was the portion of the route where Arab merchants particularly excelled, as these were home waters for them, and many of the navigational techniques used throughout the Indian Ocean had originated from Arab maritime traditions. The crossing took about 2 weeks with favorable monsoon winds. The passage was relatively uneventful, no major storms, no pirate encounters.
Chapter 6. The Amber Road. Baltic Gold to Mediterranean Sun. The winter storm had finally passed, leaving the Baltic shore transformed. Wulfric stood at the edge of the gray-green sea, his wool cloak heavy with salt spray, watching the waves retreat with rhythmic patience.
Each withdrawal revealed treasures that had traveled through time itself, fragments of amber, fossilized tree resin from forests that had existed tens of millions of years before any human walked these shores. The amber pieces glowed like captured sunlight against the wet sand, ranging from pale yellow to deep orange, some as small as peas, others as large as a man's fist. This was why his people came to these beaches after every great storm, why generations of their ancestors had walked these same sands, gathering the mysterious substance the Romans called electrum and would pay fortunes to possess. Wulfric bent to retrieve a particularly fine piece, holding it up to the weak morning light. The amber was the color of honey, translucent and warm in his palm despite the winter cold. Within its golden depths, he could see the perfect form of an ancient insect, frozen in time when the sticky resin had trapped it in some primordial forest. Such pieces commanded the highest prices from traders who came up from the south, from lands Wulfric had never seen but heard described in tales told around winter fires, lands where the sun shone hot even in winter, where great stone cities stretched to the horizon, where men wore purple cloth and ruled territories larger than his entire homeland. His daughter Helga worked nearby, her keen eyes scanning the tide line. At 12 summers, she already possessed the practiced gaze of an experienced gatherer, able to distinguish amber from ordinary rock or tree resin at a glance. The knowledge was passed from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, part of a tradition that stretched back beyond memory, beyond the songs of the oldest skalds, into the misty time when their people first settled these shores. Amber gathering was more than commerce. It was connection to ancestors, to land, to the mysterious forces that brought this golden substance up from the depths after storms. "Papa, look," Helga called, holding up a piece the size of a depth's egg, its surface rough but its interior clear as water. Wulfric moved to examine her find, turning it in the light. Perfect. This single piece would trade for a Roman bronze vessel, perhaps even one of the glass bowls that came from somewhere beyond Rome itself, from the eastern lands where glassmaking had been perfected into an art form beyond anything his people could produce. The beach was active with other gatherers from their village and neighboring settlements. Custom dictated that each family kept what they found on the stretch of shore they worked, and disputes were rare. The sea provided enough for all who had the patience to search. Old Egil, whose white beard marked him as elder of their trading consortium, moved slowly along the waterline, his accumulated wisdom able to spot amber even when partially bandied. His grandfather's grandfather had established the first trading relationships with southern merchants, and his family maintained those connections still, hosting traders who made the dangerous journey north and organizing the caravans that carried amber south in return.
Wulfric's leather pouch grew heavy with the morning's harvest. He had gathered perhaps 200 pieces, ranging from small chips to several substantial chunks. Sorted and graded, this represented wealth, not the immediate wealth of food or livestock, but the accumulated value that could be converted into metal tools, fine cloth, weapons, and the luxuries that improved life and increased family standing. The Romans' inexhaustible appetite for amber had brought prosperity to his people, transforming small tribal villages into thriving trading centers, creating a merchant class where none had existed before. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, Wulfric surveyed the beach one final time. The storm had been generous. Tomorrow's gathering might yield less, and soon winter's deeper cold would make beachwork dangerous, with ice forming along the shore and storms too violent to risk the exposure. But today had been good. Today the sea had given its gifts freely, and his family would benefit from nature's ancient bounty. They walked back to the village together, father and daughter, their pouches heavy with golden promise. The path wound through wind-bent pines, past dunes held in place by tough grasses, into the settlement that had grown prosperous on amber's value. Roundhouses with thatched roofs clustered around a central space where the trading post stood, a larger structure that served as warehouse, meeting hall, and neutral ground where merchants from different tribes conducted business without the complications of family allegiances or blood feuds. Inside the trading post, old Egil was already at work. The winter's accumulated amber lay spread across wide tables, sorted by color, clarity, and size. Egil and his assistants examined each piece with practiced eyes, separating the finest specimens, those with perfect clarity, deep color, or interesting inclusions, from the common grades. The sorting was crucial because amber's value varied dramatically based on quality. The clearest pieces, especially those with trapped insects or plant material, commanded prices that seem absurd to Wulfric. A small piece of fossilized resin trading for the same value as a slave or a fine horse.
Wulfric deposited his harvest on the examination table and watched as Egel's assistant, a sharp-eyed young man named Radomir, who had learned Latin from Roman traders, began the sorting. Most of Wulfric's pieces fell into the middle grades. Good color, reasonable clarity, suitable for carving into beads or small ornaments. But the piece with the trapped insect made Egel himself pause, lifting it close to his face, turning it in the light streaming through the open doorway.